The crosshair settled on the window, third floor, northwest corner, where the thermal bloom pulsed white against the cold Afghan night. Riley Cross's finger rested on the trigger guard of the Macmillan TAC-50, her breathing steady despite the voice screaming in her earpiece. Do not engage, Sierra 1. I repeat, do not engage. That is a civilian structure. The voice belonged to someone safe. Someone 4,000 miles away in an air-conditioned room who had never felt the weight of 11 lives pressing down on a 19-year-old's shoulders. Riley's eye burned as she stared through the scope. The world had reduced itself to mathematics, barometric pressure, spin drift, the erratic rhythm of her own heart beating against the cold stone. If he reaches that ridge, Team Echo is dead. All of them. Stand down, Corporal. That is a direct order. If you take that shot and miss, or if you hit collateral, you will face a court-martial before your boots touch American soil. Beside her, Master Chief James Dalton lay bleeding into the Afghan dirt. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Blood bubbled past his lips with each exhalation. He gripped her ankle with what strength remained, his eyes wide with a plea he refused to voice. Save them. You have 10 seconds, Cross. Make the call. Riley's finger hovered over the trigger. The physics were impossible. The ethics were worse. She thought of her brother, Ethan, 22 years old, killed on a patrol just like this one. She thought of her father, 87 confirmed kills in 2 different wars, who had put a pistol in his mouth when the silence became too loud. I'm sorry, she whispered. Not to command, not to the chief, but to the girl she used to be, 96 hours earlier. The grass at Arlington National Cemetery was perfect. Too perfect. It stretched in geometric precision across the hillside, each blade trimmed to regulation height, each white headstone aligned with mathematical accuracy that would have made a sniper weep. Riley stood before Section 60, where the fresh graves still smelled of turned earth and grief that no amount of rain could wash away. Her dress blues felt stiff against her skin, the fabric too new, the creases too sharp, the weight of the ribbons on her chest a constant reminder of things she had done that no one would ever know about. She was 22 now, but standing here surrounded by boys who would be forever 19, forever 21, forever the age they were when the world took them, she felt ancient. The morning was crystalline, one of those late September days when the humidity finally broke and the air carried the first whisper of autumn. Families moved between the graves like ghosts themselves, laying flowers, touching marble, whispering to the dead. An old man in a World War II veteran's cap knelt 3 rows over, his arthritic hands trembling as he placed a small American flag in the ground. Riley watched him struggle to stand, watched a younger woman rush to help him, watched the way he waved her off with the stubborn independence of a man who had stormed a beach and refused to admit that time was a steeper hill. The headstone was simple. Corporal Ethan James Cross, 1987 to 2009. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, beloved son, devoted brother. The dates meant he had been 22 when he died, the same age she was now. The mathematics of that coincidence felt like the universe laughing. Their father had been 22 when he first pulled a trigger in the Kuwaiti desert, when he first learned that killing was easy and living with it was the hard part. Riley reached into her pocket and withdrew a single brass casing. .50 caliber BMG. The metal was still warm from her hand. She placed it carefully on top of the headstone, where the morning sun caught the copper and made it glow like a piece of captured fire. This particular casing meant something. The others who passed by would not know what, but Ethan would know, wherever he was. You ready to tell them what really happened? The voice came from behind her, rough as gravel, familiar as home. Riley did not turn. She knew the sound of Master Chief James Dalton even before she saw him. He walked with a cane now, his gait uneven, his left leg stiff from the shrapnel that had nearly taken it. Nearly taken everything. The Navy Cross on his chest caught the light as he moved to stand beside her. Will they believe it? Riley asked. Doesn't matter. Your brother would want the truth. She looked at him then. 3 years had carved new lines into his face. His hair had gone entirely gray at the temples. But his eyes were the same blue flint she remembered from Bagram, from the Hindu Kush, from the night the world ended and began again. They'll say I'm exaggerating, that the distances were impossible, that a 19-year-old girl couldn't have done what I did. Dalton leaned on his cane, looking out over the rows of white stones. You know what your old man told me once, back in Mogadishu when I was 23 and scared out of my mind? Riley shook her head. He said the truth doesn't need permission to be true. It just is. Whether they believe it or not, that brass casing on your brother's grave came from somewhere. Came from something you did. Something you survived. Riley closed her eyes. The smell of the cemetery grass faded. In its place came the scent of burning trash and JP-8 jet fuel. The heat, the dust, the sound of rotors beating against thin mountain air. "Tell me again," she said quietly. "Tell me how it started." Dalton nodded. He understood. Sometimes the only way to carry the weight was to speak it aloud, to make the ghost real enough to hold. "It started," he said, "the way all bad things start, with someone thinking they knew better than the person pulling the trigger." 3 years earlier, West Virginia, 2008. The Cross family home sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through the Daniel Boone National Forest like a scar on the face of the earth. It was a small house built by Riley's grandfather after he came back from Iwo Jima, with 3 fingers missing on his left hand and a Medal of Honor he kept in a shoebox under the bed, because looking at it made him remember things he wanted to forget. The walls were covered in photographs, black and white images of men in uniforms spanning 3 generations, a visual genealogy of American war, World War II, Korea, the Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. The Cross family had bled for America in every war since 1945, and the walls remembered what the men tried to forget. Riley stood in the kitchen, 18 years old, holding the enlistment papers in hands that would not stop shaking. The papers felt like they weighed 100 pounds. The pen felt like it weighed 1,000. Her mother sat at the table, silent, her eyes red from crying she refused to do in front of her daughter, because Cross women were strong. Cross women did not break, even when everything inside them was already shattered. The empty chair where her father used to sit seemed to take up more space than all the furniture combined. It had been 2 years since he put the pistol in his mouth. 2 years since Riley found him in the barn, still holding the photograph of his old unit, the men who had died in the desert and in Mogadishu while he survived and spent 20 years wishing he hadn't. The kitchen smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular kind of sorrow that soaks into the walls of a house where too many people have said goodbye and not enough have come home. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. On the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like bullets, were the last photographs of Ethan. Him in his dress blues at graduation, him in country wearing full battle rattle, grinning that crooked smile that said he knew something the camera did not. Him in the casket, which they did not photograph, but Riley remembered anyway, every detail burned into her memory like a brand. "You don't have to do this," her mother said for the 7th time. Her voice was quiet, defeated, the voice of someone who already knew the answer but had to ask the question anyway, because mothers never stop trying to save their children, even when their children are hell-bent on finding the same holes in the ground their brothers found. "You don't have to prove anything to anybody." "I'm not proving anything." Riley's voice came out harder than she intended. "I'm finishing what they started." Her mother looked up sharply. "Your father started drinking himself to death when you were 12. Your brother started coming home in a flag-draped box. Is that what you want to finish?" The words hit like a fist. Riley felt the air leave her lungs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the papers in the trash and run, but instead she looked at the photograph on the mantel. Her brother Ethan in his dress blues, smiling that crooked smile he had, the one that said he knew a secret the rest of the world did not. He had died 3 months ago, an IED outside Sangin, 22 years old. His body had come home, but his eyes had not. They stayed in the desert, staring at something none of them could see. "Someone has to come home," Riley said quietly. "Someone has to walk back through that door and prove it's possible." Her mother stood. She crossed the kitchen and took Riley's face in her hands. Her palms were rough from years of work, from holding together a family that kept breaking apart in her grip. "If you go," she whispered, "I want you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't become like your father. Promise me you won't let the war eat you from the inside out." Riley wanted to promise. She wanted to say the words her mother needed to hear. But standing there in that kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of men who had made the same promise and broken it, she could not lie. "I promise I'll try," she said. It was the best she could do. 6 months later, Marine Corps Base Quantico, Scout Sniper School. The rifle range stretched for 1,000 meters, a corridor of dirt and heat and merciless Virginia sun that turned the air into something you could see, something that shimmered and danced and lied about where targets actually were. Riley lay in the prone position, her body welded to the earth, her cheek pressed against the stock of the Macmillan TAC-50. The weapon was obscene in its size and purpose, a 50 caliber anti-material rifle designed to punch through engine blocks and concrete walls, to reach out across impossible distances and turn human beings into pink mist and regret. Next to her compact frame, barely 5'4" and 120 pounds soaking wet, it looked like a child trying to play a cello built for giants. The heat was oppressive. It radiated up from the ground and pressed down from the sky and squeezed the air from her lungs like a vice. Sweat ran into her eyes, stinging, blurring her vision. She blinked it away. In the mountains, she would not have the luxury of blinking. In the mountains, a moment of blurred vision could mean the difference between saving a life and watching someone bleed out while she fumbled with her optic. The range instructor walked behind the line of shooters, his boots crunching in the gravel, with the steady rhythm of a metronome. He was a gunnery sergeant with 30 years of trigger time, a man who had killed people from distances that turned human beings into mathematical abstractions, into wind calls and elevation adjustments, and the gentle squeeze of a trigger. He had seen wars that were not on television. He had pulled triggers that were not in reports. He stopped behind Riley, his shadow falling across her like judgment. "Cross," he said, "you sure you can handle the recoil on that cannon? It weighs more than you do." Riley did not move. Her world had narrowed to the circle of glass in front of her eye. She focused on her breathing, in through the nose. Pause. Out through the mouth. Pause. The rhythm of life reduced to its most basic function. "I can handle it, Gunny." The instructor grunted. "We'll see. Target is 1,000 meters. Wind is variable. You have one shot to prove you belong here. Miss, and you're gone. No second chances. No diversity points. No special treatment because you got a vagina and a dead brother. You understand me?" Riley's finger moved to the trigger guard. "Yes, Gunny." "Then send it." She exhaled. Halfway. Held it. The world stopped. There was no sound, no heat, no doubt. Just the slow squeeze of muscle and tendon. The gradual increase of pressure against the curved metal. The trigger brake was crisp, clean, like snapping a glass rod. The rifle roared. The concussion slapped the air. The recoil slammed into her shoulder with the force of a mule kick, driving her body backward in the dirt. Smoke and burning powder filled her nose. For 3 seconds, there was only the ringing in her ears and the chemical taste of cordite on her tongue. Then the sound came drifting back across the 1,000 meters. The metallic clang of copper jacket meeting steel plate. Unmistakable. Perfect. The range instructor raised his binoculars. He stared downrange for a long moment. Then he lowered the glass and looked at Riley, who was already working the bolt, ejecting the brass, preparing for a follow-up shot that would not come. "Center mass," he said quietly. "That was a cold bore shot. No warm-up, no spotter. You read the wind by yourself?" "Yes, Gunny." "How?" Riley pushed herself up from the dirt. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and began writing. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. The data that separated life from death at distances where men became dots. "The mirage," she said. "It wasn't moving laterally. It was boiling vertically. Thermal updraft from the valley floor. If you dial windage, you miss every time. You have to hold under." The instructor nodded slowly. "Where did you learn to read trace like that?" Riley looked past him toward the distant mountains that ring the base. She thought of the hollers back home, the ridgelines where she had learned to hunt groundhogs at 600 yards, taught by a father who rarely spoke, but whose hands were steady on the rifle, whose breath was calm even when his mind was screaming. "Appalachia, Gunny, hunting groundhogs across the valley. They're smaller than people, and they don't shoot back." She walked past him toward the barracks, the heavy rifle slung across her shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. Behind her, she heard the other shooters whispering. She did not care. She had not come here to make friends. She had come here to learn how to kill at distances that made death feel like mathematics instead of murder. That night, alone in her rack, Riley pulled out the letter her brother had written her before he deployed. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft, the ink fading at the creases where she folded and unfolded it. His handwriting was terrible, all jagged capitals and crooked lines. Riles, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Don't be sad. Don't be angry. I did what I was supposed to do. I stood between the bad things and the people I love. That's all any of us can do. You're going to want to follow me. I know you. I know how you think. If you do, promise me something. Promise me you'll be better than Dad. Better than me. Promise me you'll come home. Riley folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She stared at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the breathing of the other women in the platoon. She thought about promises, about how easy they were to make and how hard they were to keep. "I'll try, Ethan," she whispered to the darkness. "I'll try." But even then, she knew trying might not be enough. 12 months later, Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, 2009. The heat at Bagram was a physical thing. It had weight and texture and malice. It pressed down on the shoulders and squeezed the breath from the lungs and made you understand why ancient peoples believed in demons that lived in the desert wind. The air shimmered above the tarmac in waves that made distant objects dance like ghosts. Like the heat itself was trying to warn you that nothing here was what it seemed, that the mountains in the distance were not just rock and snow, but graveyards waiting to be filled. For a sniper, mirage was information, a visible manifestation of heat and wind that could be read and interpreted like text. For everyone else, it was just another way the desert tried to kill you, another reminder that this place did not want you here and would take every opportunity to prove it. Riley stood on the tarmac with her sea bag at her feet, watching the C-17 Globemaster taxi toward the terminal, its massive engines screaming like tortured gods. She wore her utility uniform, the digital camouflage pattern already soaked through with sweat, even though she had only been on the ground for 20 minutes. The Macmillan TAC-50 was in a hard case slung across her back, 40 pounds of precision engineering and violent purpose. She had carried it halfway around the world, through airports where security guards looked at her like she was bringing death itself through their metal detectors. And she was. That was the job, to bring death to people who needed killing, at distances where they never saw it coming, where the last thing they heard was not the crack of the rifle, but the wet slap of their own blood hitting the dirt. Around her, the base pulsed with controlled chaos. Helicopters lifted off and landed in clouds of dust that turned the world brown. Forklifts moved pallets of ammunition and water and all the logistics that kept a war machine running. Young Marines, most of them barely older than Riley, moved between buildings with the 1,000-yard stare of people who had seen things that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. This was the rear. This was safe. And if this was safe, Riley thought, then the mountains must be hell itself. "Cross," she turned. The man walking toward her was in his late 40s, built like a tank with a gray beard and eyes the color of old ice. He wore no rank insignia, no name tape, just a simple plate carrier and a sidearm. But Riley knew who he was. Master Chief James Dalton, team leader for SEAL Team Echo, a man who had been fighting America's wars since before she was born. "Sir," she said, coming to attention. "Don't sir me, I work for a living." He looked her up and down, his expression unreadable. "You're the sniper they're attaching to my team?" "Yes, Master Chief. You look like you're 12 years old." "I'm 19, Master Chief." Dalton grunted. "When I was 19, I was scared out of my mind in the Kuwaiti desert during Desert Storm." "You scared, Cross?" Riley met his eyes. "Every day, Master Chief." "Good. That means you're not stupid." He gestured toward a Humvee idling nearby. "Throw your gear in the back. We brief in 30 mics. You're going to meet the team. Some of them are going to be assholes about having a woman attached. Ignore them, do your job. Keep your mouth shut unless you have something worth saying. You understand?" "Yes, Master Chief." Dalton started to walk away, then stopped. He turned back, his expression softer now, almost gentle. "I knew your old man," he said quietly. "Different companies, but we crossed paths in Mogadishu. 93. He saved my life once, carried me 3 clicks through the city with half my intestines hanging out. I owe him, which means I owe you. So I'm going to keep you alive, Cross. Not because you're a woman, not because of politics, but because Daniel Cross pulled me out of hell, and I pay my debts." Riley felt something crack open in her chest. A pressure she had been holding for years suddenly released. "You knew my father?" "Knew him, respected him, mourned him when I heard he was gone." Dalton's jaw tightened. "He was the best sniper I ever saw, until the war followed him home and ate him alive. Don't let that happen to you." He walked away before Riley could respond. She stood on the tarmac, the heat pressing down, the weight of legacy settling across her shoulders like a cloak made of lead and expectation. The briefing room was a plywood shack with a map of the Hindu Kush taped to the wall. The men of SEAL Team Echo filled the space with their presence, all muscle and beard and quiet competence. They wore civilian clothes and baseball caps, radiating an aura of casual lethality that made Riley feel like an imposter. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Bryce Wheeler, 35 years old, Annapolis graduate, 2 deployments under his belt. He had the look of a man who had read about war in books and now found the reality disappointing. "Gentlemen," Wheeler said, his voice clipped and professional, "let me introduce Corporal Riley Cross. She'll be augmenting our long-range reconnaissance capabilities for Operation Steel Talon. She comes to us from Scout Sniper School with high marks." A man in the back snorted. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hayes, call sign Longshot, the team's organic sniper. He was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years staring through a scope. "High marks," he said. "That's cute. Did they give her a gold star for showing up?" The room erupted in low laughter. Riley felt her face flush, but she kept her expression neutral. She had expected this, had prepared for it. "Sergeant Hayes, if you have concerns about Corporal Cross's qualifications, perhaps you'd like to settle them on the range." Wheeler's voice carried an edge now. Marcus leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Sure, sir. I could use the entertainment." 1 hour later, they stood on the rifle range in the brutal afternoon sun. The target was a steel plate, 12 inches in diameter, set at 1,000 meters. Marcus went first. He settled into position with practiced ease, his SR-25 an extension of his body. He fired. The sound rolled across the range. Downrange, dust kicked up 5 feet to the left of the target. "Wind's tricky up here," Marcus muttered, adjusting his scope. "Kestrel says 5 miles per hour easterly, but it's pushing hard." He fired again. Another miss, this time to the right. "Variable gusts," Dalton noted from behind them. "Heat thermals coming off the runway. It's playing hell with the wind calls." Marcus fired a third time. Another miss. His jaw was tight now, frustration bleeding through the professional facade. Riley stepped up to the line. She deployed the bipod on the TAC-50 and settled in behind the scope. Through the glass, she could see the mirage boiling across the range. Everyone was looking at the flags, at the Kestrel wind meter, at the instruments that promised certainty. But Riley looked at the heat. The boil wasn't moving laterally. It was rising, a vertical thermal column caused by the tarmac releasing stored heat into the afternoon air. The crosswind was a phantom, a localized eddy that meant nothing. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Visualized the bullet's path. Saw it climbing through the rising air, fighting the thermal push. She opened her eyes, exhaled halfway, held it. The trigger broke clean. The TAC-50 roared. The sound was apocalyptic, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. The concussion kicked up a cloud of dust that momentarily blinded everyone standing behind her, a brown wave that rolled over them like a tsunami. The recoil drove into her shoulder with familiar violence, a sledgehammer blow that she had learned to absorb and redirect through practiced biomechanics, through the proper angle of her body and the flex of her muscles and the understanding that fighting the recoil was how you got hurt and accepting it was how you survived. For 3 seconds, there was only silence and dust and the ringing in everyone's ears. Then the sound came drifting back across the 1,000 meters, delayed by the speed of sound, by the time it took for reality to catch up with what had just happened. The clear, unmistakable ring of copper-jacketed lead meeting hardened steel. A bell tolling in the desert. A perfect, crystalline note that said what words could not. "Hit!" Marcus lowered his binoculars slowly. "Lucky shot," he said. Riley worked the bolt. The brass casing ejected in a glittering arc, landing in the dust beside her. She settled back in, controlled her breathing, fired again. Clang! 2, Dalton counted quietly. Riley fired a third time. Clang! Center mass, Dalton said, his voice dropping an octave. Every time. Riley engaged the safety and stood. She pulled out her data book and began logging the information. Temperature 98 degrees. Barometric pressure 25.4. Thermal updraft requiring 2 minutes of angle compensation. She wrote it all down in neat, precise handwriting. "The wind's not pushing east," she said quietly, looking at Marcus. "It's a thermal column. If you dial windage, you'll miss every time. You need to hold under." She slung the rifle across her shoulder and walked toward the barracks. Behind her, the men of SEAL Team Echo stood in silence. The mockery was gone. In its place was something heavier, something that felt like the weight of the sudden expectation. Marcus Hayes stared at his kestrel like it had betrayed him. Dalton watched Riley's retreating form, seeing echoes of a man he had known 20 years ago, a man who could read wind like poetry and kill like mathematics. "Where did she learn that?" one of the SEALs asked. Dalton's voice was quiet, from a man who learned it in the worst places and paid for it with everything he had. That night, Riley lay in her rack in the female berthing area, listening to the sound of generators and distant artillery. She pulled out her brother's letter again, but this time she did not read it. She just held it, feeling the weight of paper and ink and promises that could not be kept. Tomorrow they would fly into the mountains. Tomorrow the mathematics would become murder. Tomorrow she would learn whether all the training, all the grief, all the weight of 3 generations of warriors pressing down on her shoulders would be enough. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but all she could see was the crosshairs. All she could hear was the voice that would come, the one that would tell her to stand down, to disobey her training, to choose between duty and humanity. In her dreams, she was already squeezing the trigger. In her dreams, she was already saying, "I'm sorry." But the real test was still ahead. The test that would take place on a mountain ridge in the dark, where the distance was impossible and the stakes were everything. Where a 19-year-old girl would have to decide what her father's legacy really meant, what her brother's sacrifice really cost, and whether surviving was the same thing as winning. The easy part was over. The shooting was just math. The war, she knew, would be entirely different. The C-130, Hercules that would carry them into the mountains, sat on the tarmac like a sleeping dragon, like something ancient and mechanical and indifferent to the small human dramas that played out in its shadow. Its 4 turboprop engines were silent now, but Riley could feel the potential violence coiled in them, the barely contained power that would lift them over mountains that had killed better people than her. The aircraft's camouflage paint was faded and patched, scorched in places by fire, pockmarked in others by shrapnel. This was not a new bird. This was a survivor, just like the men who would ride in its belly. Riley walked toward it in the pre-dawn darkness, her gear heavy on her shoulders, her mind quiet with the focus that came before combat. Around her, Team Echo moved with fluid efficiency, checking weapons, adjusting plate carriers, taping down loose straps that might rattle and give away a position. They spoke in the low murmurs of men who knew that every word might be their last. The air smelled of jet fuel and dust and fear that men tried to hide but could never quite eliminate. Dalton appeared beside her, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. In the pre-dawn light, he looked older than his 47 years, the weight of too many deployments carved into the lines of his face. "You good?" His voice was quiet. Riley nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat was dry despite the water she had been drinking all night. "Your father told me something once. Want to hear it?" She looked at him, always. "He said fear is just physics. Your body trying to keep you alive. Heart rate going up so you can run faster or fight harder. The trick isn't to not be scared. The trick is to be scared and do the job anyway. To feel the fear and use it instead of letting it use you." Riley thought about that. Did it work for him? Dalton's expression darkened. For a while, for years actually. He was the best I ever saw because he understood the fear and made it serve him. But then the fear got bigger than the job. Started showing up when he was home, when he was supposed to be okay. And that's when it won. They walked in silence, their boots crunching on gravel. Then Dalton stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in faded cloth. He handed it to Riley with the solemnity of a priest offering communion. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a single rifle cartridge, .50 caliber. But it was old, the brass tarnished with age, the primer slightly corroded. This was not ancient history. This was personal history. "That's from Mogadishu," Dalton said quietly. "October 3rd, 1993. The round your father chambered when he pulled me out. We were surrounded, supposed to be dead. Your old man low-crawled 500 meters through a field of fire, found me in a crater, holding my guts in with one hand and my rifle with the other. He chambered that round and waited for someone to give him a reason to pull the trigger." Dalton paused. But no one came. The enemy knew he was there, but they also knew that if they tried to finish me off, He would kill at least 3 of them first. So they waited, and he waited. For 6 hours, he waited with that round in the chamber and his finger on the trigger. What happened? Helicopter came in. Medevac, your father killed 4 men in 30 seconds while the bird was landing. But he never fired that round. Kept it chambered the whole time, then ejected it when we were wheels up. 20 years later, at a reunion, he gave it to me. Said it reminded him that sometimes the most important shot is the one you don't take. That patience is a weapon. Riley held the cartridge up to the light, watching the tarnished brass catch the sunrise. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're going to face choices up there that he faced. Choices between doing the easy thing and doing the right thing. Choices that don't have right answers, only consequences you'll carry for the rest of your life. And when you do, when you're looking through that scope and everyone is yelling and the clock is ticking, I want you to remember that courage isn't just about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to. Riley slipped the cartridge into her pocket next to her brother's letter. She felt the weight of it, this small piece of metal that connected 3 generations of war. Thank you, Chief. Don't thank me yet. Just come home. Come home with your head clear and your conscience intact. Your father couldn't do that. Your brother didn't get the chance. But you can. They boarded the aircraft through the rear ramp, the red light from the interior spilling onto the tarmac. The metal deck was slippery with hydraulic fluid. Riley found a seat along the bulkhead, strapped in, and closed her eyes. The mathematics were simple. Velocity times time equals distance. Wind pushes bullets in proportion to speed in time of flight. Simple physics. But the truth her father had learned was that mathematics only worked until it met the human heart. And in the mountains where they were going, the heart and the head would go to war. Riley opened her eyes. She looked around at the faces of Team Echo in the red light. These men who had mocked her, tested her, and now silently accepted her. She thought about her grandfather on Iwo Jima, her father in the Kuwaiti desert in the streets of Mogadishu, her brother in Sangin. All of them had gone into the mountains. Some had come back, some had not. But all of them had faced the same question. What are you willing to pay to do the right thing? The aircraft lifted into the Afghan sky, engines screaming, carrying them toward a place where the air was thin and the choices were impossible, and a 19-year-old girl would learn that legacy was not something you inherited. It was something you earned with every breath, every decision, every moment you chose to stand when running would be easier. The Hindu Kush waited below, patient as geology, eternal as stone, indifferent to the small human dramas on its slopes. Mountains did not care about courage or cowardice. They simply existed, and men came to them to test themselves or to die trying. But Riley was not indifferent. She was scared and ready, and carrying the weight of ghosts who whispered that courage was just another word for doing what terrified you most. The war was coming, and she was ready to meet it with her eyes open and her hands steady and her heart beating the same rhythm her father's heart had beaten, her brother's heart had beaten, all the way back to a beach called Iwo Jima, where a man with 3 fingers missing had learned that surviving was not the same as winning, but it was better than the alternative. She closed her eyes and felt the aircraft bank toward the mountains, toward the war, toward the test that would define everything that came after. The inside of the MH-47G Chinook smelled of hydraulic fluid and sweat and the chemical signature of war. Riley Cross sat on the vibrating metal floor, her back against the bulkhead, the Macmillan TAC-50 between her legs like a steel anchor. The massive twin rotors overhead churned the air with a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that vibrated in her teeth, in her bones. The noise erased thought, turned everything into a wall of sound. Around her, the men of SEAL Team Echo sat in tactical stillness, their gear worn like second skin. Multicam patterns, plate carriers heavy with ceramic plates, night vision goggles pushed up on helmets like insect eyes waiting for darkness. Master Chief James Dalton sat across from her, his weathered face unreadable beneath the tangle of his gray beard. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking magazines, adjusting the cant of his sidearm, running through the pre-combat rituals that kept a man alive when chaos came calling. His eyes found Riley's across the dim interior. He gave her a single nod, not reassurance, not encouragement, just acknowledgement. You are here, this is real. Do not forget. Riley pressed her hand against the pocket where the Mogadishu cartridge rested next to her brother's letter. Two pieces of metal and paper that weighed nothing and everything. She thought about Ethan, about the last time she had seen him alive, standing in the kitchen of their childhood home in his desert camouflage, telling their mother not to worry because he would be fine, because Marines always came home. He had believed it when he said it. That was the tragedy. He had believed his own lie. The crew chief appeared from the cockpit, a bulky figure in a flight suit and helmet, connected to the aircraft by a tether that kept him from being sucked out into the void. He held up two fingers. 2 minutes. The gesture rippled through the team like electricity. Men shifted, checked weapons one final time, settled into the mental space where violence lived. The Chinook banked hard, the G-force pressing Riley into the nylon webbing of her seat. They were flying nap of the earth, contour chasing just 50 feet above the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush to stay under enemy radar. Through the open ramp at the back, Riley caught glimpses of the world rushing past. Sheer cliff faces, narrow valleys where shadows pooled like spilled ink. The mountains were not the soft, rolling hills of West Virginia. These were vertical walls of stone that had broken armies, that had swallowed empires, that cared nothing for the small human struggles played out on their slopes. LZ coming up. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset, tinny and distant. Sensors reading cold. No heat signatures. We are green for insertion. Copy. Maintain profile. Dalton's voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had done this 100 times and knew that confidence was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Riley unbuckled her safety belt, timing it with the others. The team was stacking up near the ramp, forming the practiced choreography of insertion. She shuffled toward the rear, trying to get a view of the ground rushing up to meet them, but the bodies of the SEALs blocked her sightline. She shifted her weight, peering through the small gap between Marcus Hayes' shoulder and the fuselage wall. The ground below was a monochromatic wash of white and gray through the night vision overlay. The landing zone was a flat plateau overlooking a valley, a table of stone thrust up from the earth like an offering to the sky. It looked empty. It looked safe. But Riley had learned that looks were the first lie the world told you. And believing that lie was how you ended up in a flag-draped box being lowered into West Virginia clay while your mother wept and wondered why. She blinked. Her eyes, hypersensitive to contrast even through the tubes of the night vision, caught a faint variation in the soil temperature. It wasn't a body. Bodies glowed bright white, heat signatures that screamed their presence. This was subtle. A patch of ground about 10 meters from the center of the LZ was slightly darker than the surrounding rock, a shadow that shouldn't exist in the uniform cold of the mountain night. Disturbed earth. When soil is turned over, it loses heat faster than the packed dirt around it, creates a thermal signature that lasts for hours. Riley had learned that in training, had tested it on ranges where instructors buried training aids and made students find them. But this wasn't training. This was real dirt that had been moved for a real reason. And real reasons in this country usually involved explosives and wire and pressure plates designed to turn helicopters into falling debris. Pilot hold! Riley's voice cut through the comms channel, sharp and urgent. The words came out before her conscious mind had time to approve them, before the part of her brain that worried about protocol and chain of command could stop her. The channel went dead silent for a microsecond that felt like an hour. Who is that? The pilot snapped, annoyance bleeding into his tone like poison into water. Rear element. Riley forced the words out fast, racing against the seconds that separated safety from catastrophe. I have a soil anomaly at 3 o'clock, 10 meters from the landing spot. Possible IED emplacement. It's disturbed earth, not natural erosion. The thermal signature is wrong. I'm reading nothing on thermal, rear element. The pilot's voice carried the edge of a man whose patience was wearing thin, whose trust in instruments was absolute. We are 30 seconds from wheels down. We have a timeline. It's there. Riley heard her own voice rising, felt the desperation clawing at her throat. She was the youngest person on this bird, the newest, the least experienced. And she was telling a warrant officer with 3,000 flight hours that his instruments were wrong. If she was wrong, she was the hysterical teenage girl who delayed a Tier 1 operation. If she was right and nobody listened, she was the person who watched everyone die because she didn't scream loud enough. Shift the LZ 50 meters north. Do it. Belay that. Lieutenant Bryce Wheeler's voice cut in, sharp as a whip crack. Rear element, this is actual. You do not have authority to redirect flight operations. Pilot, continue approach. The seconds stretched. Riley could see it happening in slow motion. The helicopter descending toward the patch of disturbed earth. The skids touching down. The weight of the aircraft triggering whatever waited beneath. The flash. The fire. The way metal turned to shrapnel and men turned to memory. Shift it. Riley screamed into the comms, her voice breaking with the strain, with the terror of being ignored, of being right and being dismissed. She broke every rule of radio discipline, every protocol of military hierarchy. Shift the LZ now. The helicopter lurched violently as the pilot instinctively reacted to the raw urgency in her voice. The massive beast flared, banking hard to the left, sliding through the air away from the intended spot like a dancer pivoting mid-step. The sudden movement threw the SEALs off balance. Jake Morrison slammed into the bulkhead with a curse. Gear clattered. But the bird was moving, displacing north, finding new ground. The wheels touched down on rocky scree 50 meters from the original mark. The impact jarring. The turbines screaming with the effort of holding position on unstable ground. Ramp down! Go, go, go! The crew chief roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a chainsaw through wood. The SEALs surged forward, adrenaline overriding confusion, training overriding thought. They sprinted out into the swirling dust cloud kicked up by the rotors, weapons raised, fanning out into a perimeter that existed more from muscle memory than conscious decision. Riley scrambled after them, her heavy rifle banging against her thighs, the weight of it suddenly oppressive, suddenly real. She hit the dirt next to Dalton, her body finding cover behind a low berm of stone without her brain telling it to move. The Chinook roared, lifting off immediately, blasting them with a hurricane of grit and noise before vanishing into the night sky like a ghost that had never been there at all. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The kind of silence that made you understand why ancient peoples feared the dark, why they invented gods to fill the empty spaces. Riley lay in the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through bone and muscle and expose itself to the night. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, though fear was there, but from the adrenaline dumping into her system in waves that made her fingers feel electric. Dalton crawled over to her, grabbed her shoulder strap, and yanked her close. His face was inches from hers, his night vision lenses glowing like demonic eyes in the darkness. "You better have a damn good reason for overriding a flight warrant officer, Corporal." His voice was a hiss, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You almost compromised the bird. You violated chain of command. Wheeler is going to have your ass." "Watch the 3 o'clock," Riley whispered, pointing back toward the original landing spot with a hand that would not stop trembling. Dalton looked. Nothing happened. The dust settled. The night was still. "There's nothing there." He started to turn back to her, frustration building in the set of his jaw. Then it happened. Not an explosion, a flash. A single solitary trip flare, igniting with a pop that sounded like a champagne cork in the vast silence of the mountains. The flare sputtered, casting a long, dancing shadow over a mound of dirt that Riley had not seen before. A mound large enough to hide something, large enough to matter. The rotor wash from the departing Chinook had been just strong enough to disturb a tension wire, to trigger the secondary warning system. But because they had shifted north, the main pressure plate remained untriggered. If they had landed there, if the heat of the engines had touched that pressure plate, the 155mm artillery shell wired as an improvised mine would have detonated. The Chinook and everyone inside would have been vaporized, turned to pink mist and scattered metal, turned to names on a wall and grief in West Virginia kitchens. The flare died out, darkness returned, but something had changed in the silence, something fundamental. Dalton stared at the spot where the flare had burned. He didn't say a word. He looked back at Riley in the green glow of the night vision, and she saw something shift in his expression. The doubt was gone. The skepticism had evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch. "We're being watched." Marcus Hayes' voice came over the team radio, low and tight with the kind of tension that came from understanding you had walked into a trap. That was a command-detonated setup. They knew we were coming. Riley scanned the ridgeline 1,200 meters above them, her eyes hunting for the telltale signs of human presence. The air was thin here, cold enough to see breath if you weren't careful about thermal discipline. She adjusted the focus on her night vision monocular, searching the shadows. There, a single glint, not a light, not a muzzle flash, just the reflection of starlight on glass, a lens catching ambient light for a fraction of a second before someone realized their mistake and covered it. It lasted maybe half a second, but half a second was enough. "They're waiting for us," Riley said, her voice steady now, the adrenaline crystallizing into focus, into the cold clarity that came when fear transformed into purpose. She pointed toward the ridge. "Spotter position, 12 o'clock, elevation 1,000. They radioed ahead when we changed course." "Move out," Dalton ordered, his voice devoid of the earlier anger. "All stations, tactical column. Vance, you take second position right behind point. Keep your eyes open. You see something, you call it. I don't care if it's a shadow that looks funny. You call it." She wasn't luggage anymore. She was the warning system, and the warning lights were flashing red in a darkness that suddenly felt crowded with eyes. The patrol moved through the green zone like ghosts trying not to wake the dead. The term was a misnomer. On the ground, it was agricultural land hugging a dried riverbed, a tangle of irrigation ditches and mud walls offering 1,000 places to die. The fields had been abandoned when war came, crops left to wither, but the infrastructure remained. Stone walls, terraced plots, narrow passages that funneled movement into kill zones. Riley suffered. The Macmillan TAC-50 was not designed for patrol work. At 26 pounds unloaded, it was an anchor. With her pack, ammunition, water, and plates, she carried half her body weight. Her lungs burned at 8,000 feet. Each breath felt like inhaling through a straw. Her shoulders ached. Her back throbbed. But Riley was Appalachian tough, raised on ridgelines where you walk 6 miles to check fence lines. Her grandfather had walked across Iwo Jima. Her father had walked the Kuwaiti desert and Mogadishu streets. She could walk. She kept pace, breath hissing through her nose, eyes scanning high ground. "Pick it up, rear," Marcus Hayes whispered over the comms 50 meters ahead. He was moving like a shadow, fluid and fast. "Maintain interval." "Maintain interval," Dalton corrected, his voice tight with tension that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with geometry. "Vance, what are you seeing?" "Too many angles," Riley murmured, panning her thermal monocular across the canyon walls towering above them. The sheer cliffs were a sniper's paradise, offering elevation and cover and fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a bowling alley. "This is a funnel. If they engage us here, we have no cover. We're in a kill box." "We're ghosting, Vance," Wheeler's voice cut in, dismissive. "They don't know we're here." Riley paused mid-step. The sudden halt caused the operator behind her to bump into her boot. She ignored him. She focused on a cluster of rocks about 600 meters up the north face, studying the pattern through her optic. To the untrained eye, it was just scree, just loose rock debris that gravity had pulled down the mountain over millennia. But nature was random. Chaos had no geometry. And near the base of a jagged outcropping, the shadows formed a straight line. A slit. An opening too regular to be accident. "Halt!" Riley whispered into the comms, her hand going up in the universal signal for stop. The column froze instantly. 12 operators melted into the brush like smoke dissipating in wind, weapons snapping up toward the ridgeline. The sudden stillness was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the valley. "Visual on possible hide," Riley said, forcing her voice to stay calm, to sound professional instead of terrified. "North face, elevation 600 meters. Sector 4 just below the shelf. The rock pile is artificial. It's a loophole. Someone built a fighting position up there." Dalton crawled up beside her, his body moving with the efficient economy of a man who had spent decades learning how not to be seen. "Talk to me." Riley pointed with a gloved hand, keeping the movement minimal. "Sector 4, just below the shelf. See where the rocks form that straight edge? That's not erosion, that's construction. Someone stacked those stones to create a firing port. Classic high discipline." Dalton pulled out his own spotting scope, switching to thermal overlay. He stared at the spot for a long 30 seconds, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. The wind whistled through the valley, rattling the dry corn stalks near the dried riverbed, a sound like bones clicking together. "I've got nothing on thermal," Dalton said finally, lowering the optic. "Cold rock. If someone was in there, we'd see a heat bloom from body warmth or respiration. The thermal would pick it up." "They could be using a thermal blanket," Riley argued, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to control it. "Or they're deep inside a cave system where the thermal mass of the rock masks their signature." "Chief, that is a prepared fighting position. It faces directly down into this choke point. That's not coincidence. Dalton checked his wrist-mounted Garmin GPS, the small screen glowing faintly in the darkness. We are 20 minutes behind timeline. If we don't hit the compound before 0400, we lose the element of surprise. The sun comes up and we're exposed on the valley floor with nowhere to hide. We can't clear every suspicious shadow in these mountains. It's not a shadow, Riley insisted, feeling the frustration build in her chest like pressure in a sealed container. The instinct that had saved them at the landing zone was screaming at her again, a klaxon in her nervous system that something was wrong, that walking past that hide was walking into an ambush. If we walk past it, they'll have our backs. They'll wait until we're committed to the compound, and then they'll start dropping rounds on us from elevation. We'll be trapped. Dalton looked at her, then up at the dark cliffs. The conflict in his eyes was visible even under the night vision, even in the green phosphor glow that turned the world into a fever dream. He was weighing the mission against the risk. He was the hammer, and she was trying to tell him not to strike, trying to tell him that sometimes patience was worth more than speed. Breaker. Dalton radioed, using the call sign for Jake Morrison. Scan the ridge. Tell me what you see. There was a pause as Morrison brought up his own optics, as he searched the darkness for threats that might not exist. Clear, boss, Morrison replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who trusted his instruments more than his instincts. I'm not seeing anything up there. Let's move. We're sitting ducks out here. Dalton turned back to Riley. His jaw was tight, his decision made. We push. Keep an eye on it. But we are not stopping. That's an order. Riley swallowed the protest rising in her throat. She had already violated chain of command once tonight. Doing it again would end her career before it started. Copy. Her voice was flat, defeated. They moved out. Riley walked with her body turned slightly sideways, her rifle held at an awkward angle, keeping her eyes fixed on that dark slit in the rocks. It felt like walking past an open door in a bad neighborhood, like turning your back on something that was staring at you with malevolent intent. She waited for the muzzle flash. She waited for the crack that would end her life or someone else's. The tension wound tighter with every step, a spring compressing in her chest until it felt like her ribs might snap from the pressure. It didn't come. The shot never came. They walked past the hide and nothing happened. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was just rocks and shadows and paranoia. Maybe this was what happened when you let a 19-year-old with 3 months in country make tactical calls. Maybe Wheeler was right and she was just a liability, a diversity checkbox that put the team at risk with false positives and wasted time. 30 minutes later, the village emerged from darkness like a ship from fog. It was a cluster of mud brick compounds surrounded by high walls, medieval architecture that had existed before America and would remain after. The walls kept livestock in and bandits out, built by men who understood the world was hostile. The structures nestled against the mountain base. It looked silent, sleeping. Exactly the kind of place where bad things waited. Stack up, Dalton ordered, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, the kind of whisper that carried authority without volume, that made men move without question. The team transitioned into close quarters battle mode, their movements becoming fluid and silent, a choreography they had practiced 10,000 times until it lived in muscle memory instead of conscious thought, until they could do it blind and drunk and half dead and still execute with precision. They approached the main gate of the target compound, the entrance a heavy wooden affair reinforced with iron bands that had probably been there for centuries, that had been touched by hands that were now bones in unmarked graves. Jake Morrison placed a kinetic charge on the lock, a small explosive that would breach the gate without bringing down the whole structure, without announcing their presence to everyone within a mile. Set, Morrison whispered, backing away from the door with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that explosives were fundamentally untrustworthy, and treating them with respect was how you kept your fingers. Thump, the muffled explosion was barely louder than a heavy book dropped on a table, a sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the valley and the indifference of the mountains. The lock shattered into pieces of metal that clattered against stone. The gate swung inward on protesting hinges that screamed in the silence like a warning nobody heeded. Go! Go! Dalton commanded, his voice sharp as a blade. The seals flooded into the courtyard like water through a broken dam, like a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with. Lasers sweeping every corner, every window, every shadow where threats might hide and death might wait. Clear left, clear right. Room 1 clear. The calls came in staccato bursts, a verbal map of violence potential being systematically eliminated. Each room another square on a grid where someone might be and wasn't. Riley entered last, holding the perimeter as the assault element cleared the interior. Her rifle pointed at shadows that refused to resolve into targets. She expected shouting, gunfire, the chaos of a raid, the violence of men fighting for their lives in close quarters where every door might be the last door you ever open, the adrenaline surge of contact, the chemical rush that turned fear into fuel. Instead, there was only the sound of boots on packed dirt and the heavy breathing of men moving through rooms that should have been occupied but were not. That felt wrong in a way that made skin crawl and instincts scream. "Building is clear," Morrison announced, his voice confused, almost disappointed, the voice of a man who had geared up for war and found only empty rooms and questions. "It's empty. No high-value target, no guards, nothing, just furniture and cold tea." Except the tea wasn't cold. Riley walked into the small kitchen area, drawn by something she couldn't quite articulate, by an instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the part of the brain that kept humans alive when saber-toothed cats stalked the tall grass. The air smelled of cardamom and wet wool and something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up like it was being pulled by invisible fingers. She felt a strange heat emanating from the low table in the corner, a thermal signature that did not belong in a room this cold, in a building that should have been empty for hours. She reached out with tentative fingers and hovered her hand over a silver tea kettle sitting on a small tray, an ornate piece of metalwork that looked old and valuable and completely out of place in this Spartan room. The metal was hot, not warm, not lukewarm, hot. Hot enough that touching it would burn skin, would raise blisters, would leave a mark. She poured a tiny amount onto the floor, just a few drops, barely enough to wet the packed earth. Steam rose up in a thin column, swirling in the cold air like a ghost trying to take shape, like smoke from a fire that was invisible but real. "Chief," Riley said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of terrible understanding, of pieces falling into place, of realizing that they had walked into something worse than an ambush. Dalton turned and saw the steam rising from the wet spot on the floor. He froze, his body going rigid with recognition, with the sudden comprehension of what that steam meant, of what it implied about timing and intelligence, and how badly they had been played. "They didn't just leave," Riley said, looking around the room, feeling the eyes she couldn't see watching from somewhere in the darkness outside, knowing with absolute certainty that they were not alone, that they had never been alone. "They left 5 minutes ago, maybe less. When we stopped to investigate the ridge, someone radioed ahead. They knew exactly how long it would take us to get here." It was a spotter. Dalton realized, the color draining from his face even in the green glow of night vision, his expression transforming from professional calm to the kind of fear that comes from understanding you've walked into a trap and the jaws are about to close. "The hide you saw, they radioed ahead. They warned the compound. We're not the hunters. We're the bait," Riley said, gripping her rifle tighter as understanding crashed over her like a wave of ice water, as the full implications of their situation became clear. The words were still hanging in the air when the sound came. A sound that anyone who had been in combat recognized instantly. A sound that turned blood to water and made time slow to a crawl. Whoosh, the distinctive whisper of air being displaced by a rocket-propelled grenade in flight. The sound of death coming fast on wings of fire and hate. "Incoming!" Morrison screamed, his voice cracking with sudden terror, with the understanding that there was nowhere to run and no time to hide. The world turned white. The explosion did not sound like the movies portrayed. It was not a dramatic boom with a satisfying bass rumble. It was a physical slap, a violent displacement of air that punched the breath from Riley's lungs before her brain could register the noise. The RPG impacted the compound wall with the force of a meteor strike, showering the courtyard in a hail of razor-sharp stone shrapnel and burning debris that fell like rain made of knives and fire. Riley was thrown backward by the concussion, her body skidding across the hard-packed dirt like a rag doll. Her ears rang with a high-pitched squeal that drowned out all other sound, a tone so pure and loud it felt like her skull might split open to release it. For 3 seconds, she was blind. Dust, thick and choking, filled the air like a solid curtain, turning the world into a brown void where nothing existed except the taste of pulverized stone and the sensation of not knowing which way was up. Then the sound returned, not all at once, but in layers. First the ringing, then underneath it a new sound. A terrifying rhythmic chug, chug, chug of heavy machine guns echoing off the canyon walls. The distinctive report of PKM fire, high-caliber rounds designed to punch through walls and turn human beings into hamburger and memory. Contact front, contact high, elevation. The scream came from everywhere and nowhere. Multiple voices overlapping in the chaos. Men trying to impose order on a situation that had devolved into pure entropy in the span of a heartbeat. Trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. The SEALs, trained to react to contact with immediate aggression, were pouring fire toward the ridgeline, their suppressed rifles sounding like staple guns against the roaring thunder of the enemy's unsuppressed weaponry. The disparity in noise was psychological warfare in itself. The Americans whispered death. The enemy screamed it. Riley scrambled to her knees, coughing up grit that had invaded her lungs, tasting blood and dust in the chemical residue of explosives. She was in the kill box, a pre-registered target zone where the enemy had calculated the exact range and angles before the fight ever started. The courtyard was a bowl, and the shooters on the cliffs were looking right down into it like gods observing ants, like hunters watching prey walk into a trap they had spent hours preparing. Green tracers slashed through the dust, hammering the ground in angry geysers of displaced earth. The dirt erupted in patterns that looked random but were actually walking fire. Machine gunners adjusting their aim towards center mass, toward the places where people were most likely to be, where flesh and bone and dreams waited to be turned into nothing. "Get inside! Get to hard cover!" Dalton's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. The voice of a man who understood they were seconds away from being overrun and annihilated, whose training was the only thing keeping panic at bay. Riley grabbed her TAC-50, the rifle suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Like it was made of lead instead of steel. She tried to move toward the main building where the team was funneling, but the doorway had become a fatal funnel. Rounds were chewing up the door frame, splintering wood and stone, pinning them down with a volume of fire that made movement suicide, that turned the 10-foot gap between outside and inside into an impassable chasm. "Man down. Jake Morrison is down." The call came through the radio, cutting through the noise like a scalpel through flesh, the words every team leader dreads. The announcement that changes everything. Through the swirling dust, Riley saw the massive shape of Jake Morrison collapse. His right leg suddenly a ruin of shredded fabric and blood and bone fragments that should have been inside his body, but were now decorating the courtyard. Two operators grabbed his drag handle, hauling him backward into the structure, while a third laid down a wall of suppressive fire with MK-48 machine gun, the belt-fed weapon spitting rounds in long bursts that lit up the night like a strobe light, like lightning trapped in a bottle. Riley stood up to follow, to run the 10 meters that separated her from relative safety, but a line of machine gun fire stitched across the ground directly in front of her, the impact so close she felt the heat of the rounds as they passed, felt the air displacement as supersonic metal missed her by literal inches. She couldn't go forward. The door was the focal point of concentrated fire, the place where the enemy had pre-registered their machine guns, where crossing meant dying. "Vance, move!" Dalton screamed from the darkness of the doorway, his voice cracking with fear for her, with the terrible knowledge that she was about to die and he could do nothing to stop it, that he was going to watch another cross die and break another promise. She looked at him, then at the tracers tearing up the threshold, at the impacts that walked back and forth across the opening like a deadly dance. If she tried to cross that 5-meter gap, she would be cut in half. The machine gunners had the range. They had the angle. They were just waiting for someone to be stupid enough to trim him. "I can't," she yelled back, though she doubted he could hear her over the roar of gunfire, over the sound of the world ending in fire and lead. Another RPG shrieked down from the cliffs, this one aimed at the roof with malicious precision. It impacted with a thunderous crack, collapsing part of the overhang and sending a cascade of mud brick and timber crashing down like the sky itself was falling. The shock wave knocked Riley sideways, rolling her toward the outer perimeter wall like a leaf caught in a hurricane. She didn't fight the momentum. She rolled with it, tumbling into the shadows of a small animal pen attached to the outer wall, a low structure roofed with corrugated tin and heaped with dry straw that smelled of ammonia and goat dung and the particular scent of desperation. She lay flat, pressing her face into the filth, the smell overpowering even the cordite and burning wood and the copper tang of blood that filled the air. Inside the main building, the SEALs were trapped. She could hear them shouting, calling for a medic, calling for air support, calling for anything that might tip the balance back in their favor, that might transform this massacre into something survivable. But outside in the courtyard, the enemy fire was relentless, a storm of metal designed to keep the Americans pinned while maneuver elements moved in to finish them off, to turn this from an ambush into an execution. Riley checked herself with shaking hands that seemed to belong to someone else. No blood, no holes, just bruises and terror and the understanding that she was alone, separated from the team, cut off in a goat pen while men who wanted her dead walked rounds closer with every passing second. She forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, hold. Out through the mouth, hold. The rhythm her father had taught her when she was 8 years old and learning to shoot groundhogs across the hollers. The rhythm that had kept him alive in the Kuwaiti desert, in the streets of Mogadishu, until the day it stopped working, and he put a pistol in his mouth because the rhythm had become a metronome counting down to nothing. Because surviving the war was not the same as surviving what the war made you. Her heart rate slowed. The ringing in her ears faded to a dull hum that she could think around, that she could work through. She was alone. She was terrified, but she was alive. And being alive meant she could still fight, could still matter, could still change the outcome of this nightmare they had walked into. She pulled her rifle close, checking the optic with trembling fingers. The scope was dusty but intact, the glass still clear, the reticle still centered. The rifle that had carried her this far was still functional, still deadly. She was not helpless. She was not luggage. She was not a victim waiting for rescue. She was a sniper, and somewhere in the darkness, there were people who needed killing. Riley shifted her position, moving with agonizing slowness, every movement calculated to avoid detection, to avoid becoming a target. She pushed the muzzle of the TAC-50 through a gap in the rotting wood of the pen. She looked up at the cliffs through her thermal optic, switching the palette to white hot to better see against the cold background of stone and night. The enemy thought they had won. They thought the Americans were all huddled in the main building, waiting to die like rats in a trap, like prey that had exhausted all options except surrender or death. They didn't know one was outside, one who could see, one who could reach out across impossible distances and turn their advantage into ashes, their certainty into confusion. High up on the ridge, she saw it. The thermal signature she had spotted earlier, the one Dalton had dismissed because instruments said there was nothing there. But now there were more heat blooms, multiple signatures appearing along the crest line like flowers blooming in time-lapse. They were standing up, firing down with impunity, thinking they were untouchable at this distance, thinking the Americans' carbines couldn't reach them. That elevation was safety. That distance was immunity. They were 1,200 meters away, too far for the SEALs' weapons to be effective. The angle was too steep. The math was too hard. The physics were impossible. But impossible was just another word for difficult. And difficult was what the Cross family did best. Riley extended the bipod legs of her rifle, settling the weapon against the rough wood with hands that had stopped shaking, with a calm that came from knowing exactly what she had to do, from understanding that this moment was what all the training had been for, all the groundhogs across West Virginia hollers, all the hours on the range at Quantico, all the weight of 3 generations pressing down on her shoulders. She would get one shot, maybe 2, before they adjusted fire onto her position and turned the goat pen into her coffin. After that, the mathematics would not matter because she would be dead or running, and neither option would help the men dying in the building behind her. But one shot might be enough. One shot to change everything. One shot to prove that distance was just a number, and fear was just physics, and surviving was better than winning. But you had to fight to do either. Her finger moved to the trigger guard. The world narrowed to the circle of glass, to the mathematics of death and the cost of courage, to the understanding that her father had faced this same choice in Mogadishu, had made this same calculation when Master Chief Dalton lay bleeding in a crater, and the enemy waited, and the only thing between life and death was the willingness to pull a trigger, when pulling the trigger meant becoming a target. She exhaled halfway and held it, waiting for the moment between heartbeats where everything stopped and the only thing that mattered was the gentle squeeze that separated the living from the dead, the saved from the lost, the heroes from the casualties. This was what she had been born for. This was what her grandfather had done on Iwo Jima, what her father had done in the desert and in Mogadishu, what her brother had tried to do before the earth rose up and took him. This was the legacy, not the medals, not the stories, but the willingness to stand in the darkness and pull the trigger when pulling the trigger was the only thing between survival and annihilation. When mathematics became murder, and murder became the only mercy left to give. She squeezed, the rifle roared, and the war answered back with fire and fury and the understanding that the hunt had just begun, that the prey had become the hunter, that a 19-year-old girl in a goat pen with a broken scope and impossible odds had just declared that this was not over, that the Cross family did not quit, that some debts could only be paid in blood and distance, and the cold mathematics of sending death across 1,200 meters of night air. The hunt had begun, and Riley Cross was done being prey. The mathematics of death were simple. Range, 1,200 meters. Elevation angle, 35 degrees. Wind, variable, gusting between 10 and 20 miles per hour from the northeast. Barometric pressure, falling. Temperature, 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping as the night deepened. Riley Cross lay in the filth of the goat pen, her eye pressed to the scope of the Macmillan TAC-50, and calculated how to kill a man she could barely see. Through the thermal optic, the enemy sniper was a white blob against the black background of cold stone, a heat signature that pulsed with the rhythm of breathing and the warmth of a body that did not yet know it was about to die. He was deep inside a fissure in the cliff face, a vertical crack in the rock that provided cover from direct fire and a perfect angle down into the kill box where SEAL Team Echo was trapped. Riley could see the barrel of his rifle resting on a tripod, the distinctive profile of a heavy-caliber weapon, probably a .338 Lapua Magnum or even a captured American M107. She could see the way he shifted his weight, the small movements of a man who was comfortable, who thought he was untouchable, who believed distance was safety. He was wrong. Distance was just mathematics. And Riley had been doing this math since she was 12 years old, shooting groundhogs across West Virginia, hollers with her father's rifle while he sat beside her and said nothing because silence was the only language he had left after Mogadishu took everything else. The wind howled through the valley, a living thing that pushed and pulled and changed direction without warning. Riley watched the mirage through her scope, watched the way the heat waves boiled and twisted. The scope was cracked from the earlier concussion, a spiderweb fracture that ran diagonally across the lower left quadrant of the lens. It distorted the image, made the targeting more difficult, turned what should have been precision into approximation. But the center of the reticle was still clear. The kill box was still visible. That was enough. It had to be enough. Inside the compound, the radio traffic was frantic. "We're taking rounds inside." Dalton's voice was tight with controlled panic, the voice of a man who understood that walls were not safety when the enemy had the elevation and the patience to punch through them. "Jake Morrison is critical. We need immediate Casevac. Wheeler, call it in." "This is Echo Actual." Lieutenant Wheeler's voice came through, shaking with stress. "Havoc, this is Echo Actual requesting immediate close air support and medical evacuation. We have one urgent surgical, multiple wounded, taking effective fire from elevated positions. Static. The hiss and pop of a radio signal being jammed, being deliberately disrupted by equipment designed to isolate and kill. Echo Actual. You are broken and unreadable. Say again your last." "They're jamming us," Marcus Hayes said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of terrible understanding. "We can't get through to base. We're on our own." Riley shifted her aim away from the sniper and began scanning the valley. Somewhere out there was the source of the jamming, a piece of electronic warfare equipment that was cutting them off from air support, from rescue, from everything that might save them. She swept her thermal optic across the landscape, looking for the telltale heat signature of generators or amplifiers, the white-hot glow of electronics working at capacity. There, parked behind a low stone wall about 1,500 meters away, mostly hidden by the terrain, was a Toyota Land Cruiser. The civilian vehicle looked innocuous, just another truck in a country full of trucks. But rising from the rear bed was a vertical line, thin and straight, a whip antenna that was too long and too sophisticated to be civilian radio. And at the base of that antenna, glowing white on the thermal display, was the unmistakable heat bloom of an amplifier running at full power, turning a small radio signal into a wall of electronic noise that blanketed the military frequencies. Echo 1, this is Sierra 1, Riley transmitted, using the call sign Dalton had given her. I have the jammer, technical vehicle, grid 44, approximately 1,500 meters northwest of compound. High gain antenna, active amplifier. Permission to engage. There was a pause, a long pause filled with the sound of gunfire and men dying and decisions being weighed on scales that had no good options. Range is extreme, Dalton replied finally. Can you make the shot? Riley looked at the truck through her cracked scope. 1,500 meters, nearly a mile. At that distance, the bullet would take almost 3 seconds to arrive, would drop over 30 feet, would be pushed laterally by any crosswind. She would not be shooting at a man. She would be shooting at a piece of electronics the size of a shoebox mounted in the bed of a moving truck on uncertain ground through a damaged optic in variable wind with no spotter and no second chance. Sending it. Riley said because what else was there to say? Because the alternative was watching good men die while she did nothing. Because her brother Ethan had died doing nothing, had stepped on a pressure plate and been erased from existence before he could fire a shot. And she would be damned if she did the same way, passive and helpless and forgotten. She settled the crosshairs on the antenna base. She did not have enough elevation adjustment left in her scope to compensate for the extreme range, so she held over, aiming at a point in empty space above the target, trusting physics and experience and the ghost of her father who whispered in her memory about patience and breathing and the space between heartbeats where the world stopped and truth lived. She exhaled. Halfway, held it. The trigger broke clean. The recoil slammed into her shoulder. A familiar violence that she rode instead of fighting. Through the scope, she watched the trace of the bullet, a distortion in the air that arced up, and then began its long fall toward the earth. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The truck sat there, oblivious, the antenna still transmitting, still jamming, still killing them with silence. The round impacted low and left, missing the amplifier by 6 inches and punching through the truck's hood with a sharp metallic clang that carried across the valley. Not a kill shot, but close enough that the men around the truck scattered, diving for cover, abandoning their equipment in sudden terror. Adjust. Riley worked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass, chambering a fresh round. She made the correction in her head. 6 inches low meant she had underestimated the wind drift. 6 inches left meant the crosswind was stronger than she thought. She adjusted her hold, aiming higher and farther right, compensating for variables she could only guess at. She fired again. This time the bullet struck true, hitting the amplifier housing with enough kinetic energy to shatter the electronics inside. On the thermal scope, a sudden bright flare of electrical discharge erupted as capacitors blew and circuits melted. The antenna toppled over, crashing onto the hood of the truck in a shower of sparks. Jammer is down, Riley transmitted, her voice steady now, the adrenaline crystallizing into focus. In the compound, the radio suddenly crackled to life. Havoc, this is Echo Actual. Do you copy? Echo Actual, this is Havoc. The voice from the Joint Operations Center was clear as a bell, no longer fighting through the wall of jamming. We read you 5 by 5. Go ahead with your traffic. We need immediate close air support in Kesavac. Wheeler's voice carried relief and desperation in equal measure. Grid follows. But Riley was not listening to the radio chatter anymore. She was watching the cliff face where the enemy sniper had resumed his methodical destruction of the compound. Through her thermal optic, she could see the rhythm of his work. Shift, aim, fire. The heavy rounds punching through the mud brick walls, seeking the men hiding inside. Each shot was placed with surgical precision, walking up and down the building, probing for targets, turning cover into concealment and concealment into coffins. Thump, a heavy report echoed across the valley. Different from the crack of AK-47s or the chatter of PKM machine guns. This was the deep bass note of a large caliber rifle, a sound that Riley felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. "Man down!" The cry came from inside the compound, anguished and urgent. "Marcus is hit. Through the wall. He's hit through the damn wall." Riley's world narrowed to the thermal image of the enemy sniper. He was killing her people, killing men who had accepted her, who had stopped seeing her as a liability and started seeing her as part of the team. Marcus Hayes, who had mocked her on the range and then taught her the difference between killing and murder. Master Chief Dalton, who had known her father, who carried the weight of Mogadishu in the dead of survival. They were dying because she could not make this shot from her current position. The geometry was wrong. From the valley floor, looking up at the cliff, she could not see into the fissure. The angle was too shallow. The sniper was too deep inside his hide. She could see the barrel, could see the heat signature, but she could not see enough of him to guarantee a kill. At this distance, at this angle, a miss meant the sniper would adjust fire to her position and she would die in a goat pen surrounded by filth and failure. She needed elevation. She needed to be higher, to change the geometry, to look down into the fissure instead of up at it. She needed to climb. The cliff face to her right rose vertically for 300 feet, a jagged wall of limestone and shale that looked like it had been shattered by the fist of an angry god. It was not a climbing wall. It was not even a scrambling wall. It was a vertical maze of loose rock and treacherous holds in places where the stone would give way under weight and send you tumbling down to break on the rocks below. But halfway up that face, maybe 80 meters above the valley floor, was a narrow shelf, a ledge barely wide enough for a prone body. From there, the angle would change. From there, she could look down into the enemy hide. From there, she could make the shot. "Echo 1, this is Sierra 1, Riley transmitted, making the decision even as she spoke the words. "I cannot engage from current position. No angle on target. I'm moving to elevated firing position." "Negative, Sierra 1, Dalton's voice came back immediately. "You are in defilade. You move, you'll be exposed to every gun on that ridge. Stay put." "If I stay put, you die," Riley said simply. "The sniper is systematically destroying your cover. He's going to kill all of you unless someone stops him. I can stop him, but I have to climb." There was silence on the radio. Riley knew what Dalton was thinking. He was calculating odds, weighing her life against the lives of his team, trying to decide if saving 10 men was worth sacrificing one woman. It was the kind of math that commanders did in the dark, the kind of math that left scars that never healed. "How long?" Dalton asked finally. 10 minutes to climb. 2 minutes to set up and acquire target." Riley was lying. It would take at least 20 minutes to climb that cliff in the dark with a 26-pound rifle on her back. But she could not tell him the truth because the truth was that they did not have 20 minutes. Marcus was bleeding. The walls were failing. The enemy was closing. "You have 12 minutes, Dalton said. "After that, we're coming out fighting and we'll take our chances in the open. Clock starts now." Riley did not waste time acknowledging. She grabbed her rifle, checked that the magazine was seated, and slithered out of the goat pen into the open ground between the compound and the cliff. The distance was 50 meters. 50 meters of flat open space where she would be silhouetted against the lighter stone of the cliff face, where any enemy with night vision would see her moving, where machine gunners could track and kill her before she made it halfway. She ran, not like a soldier with tactics and fire and movement. She ran like a deer fleeing a hunter, low and fast and desperate. The dirt erupted around her boots as machine gun fire found her, as tracers reached out like the fingers of death trying to drag her back. She did not look at the impacts. She did not think about the bullets. She thought about her brother Ethan, about how he had run toward danger because that was what Cross family did, how he had died running and she would not dishonor that by dying standing still. She hit the base of the cliff and dove into a narrow crevice, pressing her back against the cold stone, gasping for air that would not come. Her heart hammered so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Her hands shook with adrenaline and terror and the knowledge that she had just used up the first of what might be her last few minutes of life. "Sierra 1, report." Dalton's voice in her ear, tight with worry. At the base, Riley wheezed, trying to control her breathing. Starting the climb, she looked up. The cliff face rose above her, disappearing into darkness. A vertical challenge that would have been difficult in daylight with proper equipment and a team. In the dark, Dark, with a rifle on her back and enemies shooting at her and a timer counting down to catastrophe, it looked impossible. Riley thought about her grandfather, clawing his way up the black sand of Iwo Jima with 3 fingers blown off and machine guns trying to cut him in half. She thought about her father, carrying Master Chief Dalton through Mogadishu with his intestines threatening to spill out with every step. She thought about what they had endured, what they had survived, what they had paid. And then she started to climb. The rock was sharp, biting into her gloves, threatening to shred the fabric and the skin beneath. Every handhold was a gamble, every foothold a prayer that the stone would hold just long enough. The TAC 50 on her back was a malevolent presence, pulling her backward, throwing off her balance, making every movement harder than it should have been. The rifle sling dug into her shoulders, cutting off circulation, making her arms go numb. 10 meters up, 20. She climbed with the focused intensity of someone who understood that thinking about the drop would kill her faster than falling. She did not look down. She looked up, always up, finding the next hold, testing it with her weight, committing only when she had no choice. At 40 meters, disaster struck. She reached for a protruding slab of gray limestone, testing it with her weight. It felt solid, locked into the cliff face by geology and time. She committed, pulling herself up, trusting the rock. The slab sheared off with a crack like a gunshot. Riley's right hand flew back, grasping at empty air. Her body swung violently to the left, the weight of the rifle acting as a pendulum, pulling her away from the cliff. Her left boot scraped uselessly against smooth stone, finding no purchase. She was falling. Her left hand, still gripping a small outcropping of rock, was all that kept her from the long drop to the valley floor. Her fingers screamed with pain, the tendons threatening to tear, the bones threatening to snap. The rifle on her back pulled relentlessly downward, gravity and weight conspiring to rip her from the mountain. She hung there for a heartbeat that lasted a lifetime. Her right hand flailed, searching desperately for anything to grab. Her boots kicked at the cliff face, trying to find a ledge, a crack, anything that would take some of the weight off her failing left hand. Her fingers found a root, a stubborn scrub bush growing out of a crack in the rock, its roots buried deep, its existence a biological impossibility and her only salvation. She grabbed it with her right hand, testing it gently at first, then with more weight as she realized it was holding. She got her right boot onto a small ledge, then her left. The immediate crisis passed, leaving her shaking and gasping and pressed against the rock like she wanted to merge with it. The dislodged slab tumbled down the cliff face, clattering loudly against the stone, each impact echoing across the valley like a drum announcing her presence. It crashed into the scree at the bottom with a sound that was far too loud, far too distinctive. Riley froze. She did not breathe. She did not blink. She pressed her face into the lichen-covered rock and became stone herself, hoping that stillness would make her invisible, that the enemy would mistake the rockfall for natural erosion and not the flailing of a climber who had nearly died. Below, the machine gun fire shifted. The enemy had heard the rockfall. A line of bullets probed the cliff face, searching for movement, for the source of the noise. Dust puffed up 10 feet to her right as rounds impacted stone, then 10 feet to her left. They were reconning by fire, shooting blindly, hoping to provoke a reaction. Riley did not react. She died, not literally but tactically, forcing her body to go limp, surrendering to the uncomfortable position. Her right leg was twisted at an awkward angle, the muscle already cramping. Her left shoulder throbbed where it pressed against a sharp edge of rock. The rifle dug into her spine. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to adjust, to find comfort. She stayed perfectly still, because movement was death, because the human eye was drawn to motion, because her father had taught her that the hardest part of hunting was not the shot, but the waiting, the ability to endure discomfort until discomfort became normal and normal became invisible. 5 minutes passed. The bullets stopped hitting the wall. The enemy grew bored, their attention drawn back to the compound where the SEALs were still fighting, still dying. Riley finally moved, just her pinky finger at first, then her wrist, then her neck. Small movements, glacially slow, testing to see if the enemy was still watching. No response, no bullets. She was alone on the cliff face, forgotten in the larger battle. She resumed the climb. This time she did not rush. She moved with the agonizing slowness of a chameleon stalking prey, testing every hold twice, trusting nothing. The timer in her head said she was out of time. Dalton would be preparing to abandon the compound, to make a desperate run for the secondary extraction point that might not even be reachable. Men would die because she was too slow. But rushing had nearly killed her. Slow was the only way to survive. She climbed with patience her father had taught her, with determination her grandfather had modeled, with the stubborn refusal to quit that defined the Cross family even when quitting was the rational choice. She reached the shelf as the last light of false dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The ledge was narrow, barely 3 feet deep, hidden behind a screen of dead brush that provided concealment, if not cover. Riley pulled herself over the lip and rolled onto her back, staring up at the stars that were beginning to fade as morning approached. Her lungs heaved, sucking in air that was too thin to satisfy. Her hands were shredded, the gloves torn through, blood seeping from a dozen small cuts. Her shoulder ached with the dull, persistent throb of muscles pushed beyond their design limits. She wanted to lie there. She wanted to close her eyes and sleep and wake up in West Virginia, where the worst thing that could happen was a groundhog getting away. But Marcus was bleeding. Dalton was waiting. The sniper was killing. Riley rolled onto her stomach and deployed the bipod legs of the TAC-50, settling them into a small depression in the rock. She brought the rifle to her shoulder, ignoring the pain, and looked through the cracked scope. The angle had changed. From up here, she was no longer looking up at the cliff face. She was parallel to it, at nearly the same elevation as the enemy hide. The fissure that had been a black void from below was now visible, the interior of the natural cave exposed to her view. She could see the sniper clearly now. He was hunched over his rifle, his eye to his scope, methodically placing shots into the compound below. Behind him was a spotter with binoculars calling corrections. And deeper in the cave, barely visible, was another figure. Larger, not wearing tactical gear, but traditional dress, holding a radio handset. The commander, the man coordinating the entire ambush. Riley had a choice: kill the sniper and stop the immediate threat, or kill the commander and decapitate the entire operation. The sniper was the certain shot, center mass, high probability kill. The commander was partially obscured, a more difficult target, but potentially more valuable. She thought about what her father had told Master Chief Dalton, the story about the Mogadishu cartridge, about patience being a weapon, about the most important shot sometimes being the one you did not take. But she also thought about Marcus bleeding out, about the clock running down, about how patience was a luxury you could afford when you had time, and she had none. She aimed at the commander, because killing one man to save 10 was mathematics, but killing the right man to save hundreds was strategy, because her father had taught her to shoot, but Master Chief Dalton had taught her to think. The wind gusted across the shelf, strong enough to push her hair back, strong enough to matter. She watched the mirage, watched the way the heat rising from the valley floor created updrafts and downdrafts and invisible rivers of air that would push her bullet off course. The crack in her scope created a prism effect, splitting light at odd angles, making precise aiming more difficult. She did not have a ballistic computer. She did not have a weather station. She had a broken scope in a brain that was misfiring from exhaustion and fear and too much adrenaline over too many hours. But she had instinct. She had experience. She had the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of men who had learned to kill at distance and paid for that knowledge with pieces of their souls. Riley centered the blurry crosshairs on the commander's chest. She breathed, in through the nose, filling her lungs with thin mountain air that tasted of stone and snow. Out through the mouth, emptying herself of everything except the shot. In again, slower this time, feeling her heart rate drop, feeling the adrenaline crystallize into focus. She exhaled halfway and held it. The world stopped. There was no wind, no fear, no doubt, just physics and will, and the understanding that everything that came after this moment would be shaped by what happened in the next half second. Her finger increased pressure on the trigger, a steady rearward motion that was more feel than thought. The trigger broke with a crisp snap that she felt more than heard. The rifle roared. The muzzle brake vented burning gas to the sides, creating a pressure wave that kicked up dust from the ledge. The recoil drove into her injured shoulder with violence that made her vision gray at the edges. But she held her position, her eyes staying on the scope, watching for impact. The bullet crossed 1,200 meters in just over 2 seconds. It flew true for most of its flight, a copper-jacketed messenger of death spinning at 200,000 revolutions per minute. But in the last 100 meters, a crosswind gust that Riley had not accounted for pushed the round 6 inches to the left. The bullet missed the commander's chest. It struck him in the right shoulder, shattering his clavicle, spinning him around and slamming him into the cave wall. He dropped the radio handset, his arm hanging uselessly, blood spreading across his traditional vest in a dark stain. Not a kill shot, but close enough. The spotter saw where the shot had come from. He saw the muzzle flash from Riley's position. He shouted something in Pashto, pointing directly at her ledge. The sniper swung his heavy rifle around, abandoning the compound, seeking the new threat. Riley worked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass, chambering a fresh round. The sniper was acquiring her position, his scope sweeping the cliff face, searching for her exact location. She had seconds before he found her. Seconds before their duel became mutual instead of one-sided. She did not aim at the sniper. She aimed at his rifle, at the massive scope mounted on top of the heavy barrel, at the optic that cost more than a car and took months to properly zero. A scope that was infinitely more fragile than the man behind it. She fired. The round struck the enemy's scope mount, shattering the optic in an explosion of glass and aluminum. The sniper recoiled, his face cut by flying fragments, his weapon suddenly rendered useless for precision shooting. Riley did not wait to see the result. She rolled left, abandoning her firing position just as return fire began to impact where she had been. Heavy rounds from the cave, lighter fire from the ridge, all converging on the spot where she was no longer located. She pressed herself into a small depression in the rock, making herself as small as possible, and keyed her radio. Echo 1, Sierra 1. Primary sniper is combat ineffective. His optic is destroyed. Commander is wounded. The hide is neutralized. There was a pause, filled with the sound of gunfire that was already beginning to slacken, beginning to lose its coordination now that the voice giving orders was silenced. Sierra 1, this is Echo Actual. Dalton's voice carried something Riley had never heard from him before, something that sounded like pride. Outstanding shooting. What's your status? I'm pinned down on a cliff ledge with about 30 insurgents trying to kill me and nowhere to go. Riley's voice was surprisingly calm given the circumstances. But the primary threat is down. You should be able to move. Negative. We don't leave people behind. Hold position. Air is inbound. 2 minutes. Chief, I don't have 2 minutes. Riley looked at the volume of fire concentrating on her position. I have maybe 30 seconds before they flank me or bring up an RPG. Then make those 30 seconds count. You're a Cross. This is what you people do. The words hit Riley harder than the recoil had. This is what you people do. Not what soldiers do, what Cross family did, what her grandfather had done on Iwo Jima when the world was ending and surviving meant doing impossible things. What her father had done in Mogadishu when carrying a wounded man should have killed them both. What her brother had tried to do before the IED made trying irrelevant. Riley looked at her rifle. She had 4 rounds left in the magazine. 4 shots to hold back an army that was already moving to kill her. The math did not work. The odds were impossible. But impossible was just another word for difficult. And difficult was what the Cross family did best. She shifted position, finding a new angle, and brought the rifle to her shoulder again. Through the cracked scope, she could see insurgents moving up the cliff face using a goat trail she had not seen, approaching from her left flank. They were 200 meters away and closing. Easy shots at this range, almost insultingly easy compared to what she had just done. Riley settled the crosshairs on the lead climber and exhaled. The trigger broke. The man fell, tumbling backward off the narrow trail, his body cartwheeling down the cliff face in a way that would have been almost comical if it had not been so horrific. She worked the bolt, acquired the second target, fired. Another man fell. The remaining climbers dove for cover, suddenly aware that approaching this woman was suicide. 2 rounds left, and somewhere in the valley below, the sound of jet engines began to grow. The rising scream of an F-16 coming in hot, carrying ordnance that would turn the ridge into a crematorium. Riley allowed herself a smile, a small one, the kind of smile her father used to get when he made an impossible shot on a groundhog that he had no business hitting. The smile that said the universe had thrown its best at him and he was still here, still breathing, still in the fight. She keyed her radio one more time. Echo 1, this is Sierra 1. Tell that pilot to make it count. I'm right in the middle of the target area, and I'd really like to not be here when the bombs drop. Copy that, Dalton replied, and Riley could hear the smile in his voice too. 30 seconds. Mark your position with IR strobe so he doesn't hit you by accident. Riley pulled the infrared strobe from her vest and activated it, placing it on the ledge where it began to pulse with a light invisible to the naked eye, but bright as a beacon to the pilot's sensors. She pressed herself into the rock, making herself as small as possible, and waited for the sky to fall. The F-16 came in from the south, flying so low Riley could feel the pressure wave as it passed overhead. The pilot released his ordnance, 2 GBU-12 paveway laser-guided bombs that fell away from the aircraft and began their terminal descent, their guidance fins adjusting constantly, seeking the laser designator that someone in the compound was pointing at the enemy positions. Riley closed her eyes and covered her ears and prayed to a god she was not sure she believed in. That accuracy was as advertised, and that close air support was not too close. The world exploded, not once but twice, the bombs impacting seconds apart, the detonations so powerful they felt like the mountain itself was coming apart. The concussion wave hit Riley like a physical blow, lifting her off the ledge and slamming her back down. Rocks and debris rained from above. Dust and smoke filled the air until she could not see her hand in front of her face. And then slowly the dust began to settle. The ringing in her ears faded to a manageable roar. She opened her eyes and looked at a world that had been fundamentally rearranged. The ridge where the enemy had been was now a smoking crater. The cave where the sniper had hidden was collapsed, tons of rock having fallen to seal it forever. Sierra 1 report, Dalton's voice in her ear, urgent and worried. Still here. Riley coughed, tasting blood and dust. Still alive. Still not sure how. Can you move? Riley tested her limbs. Everything hurt, but everything moved. Yeah, I can move. Then get down from that cliff. Before it decides to finish what it started, we have birds inbound for extraction. 5 minutes. Riley looked at the climb down. It looked even more impossible than the climb up. But she had climbed up with enemies shooting at her and a timer counting down. Now she had silence and help incoming and all the time in the world. She started down, moving carefully, testing each hold, taking her time. Because surviving the fight only to die in a fall would be the kind of irony that would make her father's ghost laugh and her mother's heart break, and she refused to give the universe that satisfaction. Halfway down, she paused and looked back at the cave that was now a tomb. She thought about the men inside, about the sniper who would never shoot again, about the commander who would bleed out in the dark surrounded by fallen stone. She had killed them. Not in the clean, abstract way of long-range precision, but in the brutal finality of bringing a mountain down on their heads. She waited for the guilt, waited for the horror, waited for her humanity to reassert itself and make her feel something about taking human life. It did not come. Maybe later. Maybe in nightmares. Maybe in the quiet moments when the war was over and she had time to remember. But right now, on this mountain, with her people waiting below, she felt only the cold satisfaction of a job done and a debt paid and a promise kept. She reached the bottom as the Chinook appeared over the ridge, its rotors beating the air, coming to take them home. The SEALs stumbled out of the compound, carrying their wounded, supporting each other, a team that had survived because one 19-year-old girl had climbed a cliff in the dark and made impossible shots with a broken scope and refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. Master Chief Dalton met her at the base of the cliff. He looked at her torn gloves, her bloody hands, the exhaustion in her eyes. He did not say thank you. He did not congratulate her. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything that words could not. Marcus Hayes was on a litter, his leg bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. But he was conscious. He was alive. He saw Riley and managed a weak smile. Remind me, he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. Remind me never to piss you off. Riley smiled back. Too late for that. You already did. On the range, remember? He laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. Yeah, I remember. I was an asshole. You were, Riley agreed. A decent. But you got better. The helicopter touched down, blasting them with dust and noise and the promise of extraction. The SEALs loaded on board, Riley helping carry Marcus's litter, her small frame straining under the weight but refusing to let go, refusing to let anyone else bear the burden. As the bird lifted off, Riley looked back at the valley, at the compound that had almost been their tomb, at the cliff she had climbed, at the mountain that had tested her and found her worthy. The sun was rising now, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of gold and red, beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent to the small human drama that had just concluded on its slopes. She touched the pocket where the Mogadishu cartridge rested, the one her father had never fired, the one that represented patience and discipline and knowing when not to pull the trigger. She had pulled the trigger tonight, multiple times, had killed men whose names she would never know, had brought violence to a violent place and survived the consequences. Her father would have understood, her grandfather would have approved, her brother would have been proud. But the question that kept circling in her mind, the question that would follow her home and haunt her dreams, was simpler and more terrible. What had she become on that mountain? What had the Cross family legacy cost her? And was the price of survival worth what she had paid? The helicopter banked toward base, toward safety, toward the long road home that would be harder than any climb she had just made. Riley closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But all she could see was the crosshairs. All she could feel was the trigger breaking. All she could hear was the sound of men dying at distances that turned murder into mathematics. And she knew with a certainty that made her bones ache that this was only the beginning. That the hardest part was not surviving the mountain. It was surviving what the mountain had made her. The inside of the Chinook smelled of blood and vomit and fear that had transformed into relief but not yet dissipated. Riley Cross sat on the vibrating metal floor, her back against the bulkhead, watching the medic work on Marcus Hayes with frantic efficiency, fighting to keep a soul tethered to a body that wanted to let go. The helicopter banked hard, taking evasive action, and Riley felt her stomach surge. She swallowed it down. Cross women did not vomit where people could see. Across from her, Master Chief James Dalton sat with his head tilted back, eyes closed, face the color of concrete. The bandage around his neck was soaked through with blood. The white gauze turned dark red and still expanding. He was dying. Maybe not in the next 5 minutes, but the arterial bleed was winning against the pressure dressings and clotting agents. "We need to move faster," the medic shouted. "He's losing too much blood. I can't stop it." "We're at maximum speed." The pilot's voice came through, tinny and distant. "ETA to Bagram is 8 minutes. 8 minutes was a lifetime when you measured time in heartbeats. Riley watched the chief's chest rise and fall, each breath shallower than the last. This man had known her father, had been saved by her father, had carried that debt for 30 years and now was dying because she had not been fast enough. "Chief," Riley said, crawling across the vibrating floor to kneel beside him. She took his hand, the one that was not pressed against his neck wound. His fingers were cold, too cold. "Chief, stay with me." Dalton opened his eyes. They were pale blue and fading, like paint left too long in the sun. "Cross." His voice was a whisper, barely audible over the engine noise. "You did good up there. Your old man would be proud. You're going to be fine." Riley squeezed his hand, trying to transfer warmth, trying to will life into him through skin contact and desperation. "We're almost there. You're going to make it." "Tell my son," Dalton coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Tell him his dad died doing the job. Not like your father. Tell him I went outstanding." "You're not dying." Riley's voice broke. "You don't get to die. You owe me, Ike. You owe my family. You have to live to pay that debt." Dalton smiled, a small, sad expression that made him look ancient. "Debt's paid, kid. I kept you alive. That's all your dad asked. That's all I had left to give." His eyes closed, his breathing stuttered. The medic pushed Riley aside, hands moving with renewed urgency, checking pulse points, adjusting IV lines, doing all the desperate things that medical training demanded, even when training knew it was not enough. "Don't you quit on me," the medic shouted at Dalton's unconscious form. "Don't you dare quit, Chief." That's an order. But orders meant nothing to a body that had lost too much blood. Orders meant nothing to a heart struggling to find pressure to pump. Orders meant nothing when the universe had decided that this was the moment, this was the place, this was the end. Riley turned away. She could not watch this, could not bear witness to another death that felt like it was her fault. She stared out the open ramp at the mountains receding behind them, at the Hindu Kush turning golden in the morning light, beautiful and terrible, and indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in the helicopter above it. Her hands were still shaking. Not from fear anymore, but from something else. something that felt like rage and grief mixed together until they were indistinguishable, until they were just raw emotion with no name and no outlet. She had climbed a cliff. She had made impossible shots. She had done everything right, and men were still dying. "We're on final," the pilot announced. "Bagram in 60 seconds, medical is standing by." The helicopter descended fast, flaring at the last moment. The wheels hit hard. The ramp dropped, and a team of medics swarmed aboard with a litter and equipment in organized chaos. They lifted Dalton onto the litter with practiced efficiency, starting new IV lines, doing assessments Riley could not follow. She watched them carry him down the ramp and across the tarmac toward a waiting ambulance. Watched them load him inside. Watched the doors close and the vehicle speed away with lights flashing and sirens screaming. And then he was gone. Just gone. One moment there, the next not. Riley stood on the tarmac in the brutal Afghan sun with blood on her hands and questions in her head that had no good answers. Cross, a hand touched her shoulder. She turned. It was Marcus Hayes being helped down the ramp by two SEALs, his wounded leg held at an awkward angle, his face tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. "You saved us. All of us. You know that, right?" Riley looked at him, at the blood soaking through his bandages, at the way he leaned on his teammates because standing alone would mean falling. "Did I?" she asked quietly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I got good men killed." "Jake Morrison is alive," Marcus said firmly, "and the chief isn't dead yet. He's tougher than you think." But his eyes did not believe his words. His eyes said what his mouth would not, that Dalton was dying and they all knew it. Riley watched them carry Marcus toward the medical building. Watched the rest of Team Echo stagger off looking like survivors of a shipwreck. She should have felt proud. She should have felt something other than the hollow emptiness that seemed to have taken up residence where her heart used to be. "Corporal Cross," a voice called from across the tarmac. Sharp, official. Riley turned. Lieutenant Bryce Wheeler was walking toward her, his uniform still clean, his face set in an expression of authority. Behind him walked two military police, their sidearms visible. "Sir." Riley came to attention. She was too tired to do it properly. "You are to come with me," Wheeler said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Commander's orders. There are questions about the conduct of the operation." "Questions about what?" Riley felt ice water replace blood in her veins. "I followed orders. I engaged threats. I saved the team." "You violated chain of command." Wheeler's voice carried satisfaction, like he had been waiting to say these words. "You overrode flight operations at insertion. You abandoned your assigned position during contact. You engaged targets without proper authorization. You called in danger close air support that nearly killed American personnel. There will be an inquiry." "An inquiry." Riley repeated the word like it was foreign. "I saved 13 lives, 14 if the chief makes it. And you want to investigate me for how I did it?" "I want to investigate you for insubordination, reckless endangerment, and violation of rules of engagement." Wheeler stepped closer, voice dropping to a hiss. "You think you're special because you can shoot? You think being able to hit targets makes you exempt from discipline? You're a corporal. You follow orders. You don't question them. You don't override officers. And you certainly don't make tactical decisions above your pay grade." "Am I under arrest, sir?" Riley asked quietly. Wheeler hesitated. "Not yet. But you are confined to base pending the inquiry. You will surrender your weapon. You will not speak to any member of Team Echo. You will make yourself available for questioning. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Riley unslung the TAC-50, the rifle that had carried her through hell, and handed it to one of the MPs. The man took it carefully, reverently, like he was accepting something sacred. "Follow me." Wheeler turned and walked toward the administrative building. The MPs fell in beside Riley, not quite escorting, but making it clear she was not free to leave. They walked through the base in silence. Around them, the machinery of war continued. Helicopters landed and took off. Trucks moved supplies. Young men and women went about the business of fighting a war that had no clear end. No one looked at Riley. No one seemed to notice that she was covered in blood and dust and exhaustion. She was invisible. The administrative building was plywood, temporary, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. "Wait here." Wheeler pointed to a chair outside a closed door. "Someone will be with you shortly." He disappeared into an office. The MPs took up positions on either side of the hallway. Riley sat and stared at the wall. There was a poster about operational security, another about suicide prevention with a phone number that probably did not work, a third about staying hydrated, all peeling at the corners, giving up. Time passed. Riley was not sure how much. Eventually, the door opened and a man emerged. He was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and a face carved from granite. He wore the eagles of a full colonel and the expression of someone who had seen too much and believed too little. Corporal Cross, his voice was neutral. I'm Colonel Hendricks. I'll be conducting the preliminary inquiry into the events of last night. Please come in. Riley stood and followed him into the office. It was small, cramped, filled with files and bureaucracy, a computer that looked ancient, a window looking onto the tarmac. Sit. Hendricks gestured to a chair. Riley sat. He did not. Instead, he paced, hands clasped behind his back, studying her. Let me be clear, Hendricks said finally. This inquiry is about whether you followed proper procedures, whether you respected chain of command, whether your decisions were appropriate for your rank and experience. With respect, sir, my decisions kept people alive. Riley's voice was flat. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to follow orders. Hendricks stopped pacing. We're supposed to trust that people above us have information we don't have. You overrode a warrant officer's flight decision. You questioned a lieutenant's tactical assessment. You called in air support without authorization. Each of those actions would be grounds for court-martial. Together, they paint a picture of a soldier who thinks she knows better than her superiors. I do know better than Lieutenant Wheeler. Riley said it quietly, but the words hung in the air. He froze in contact. He gave orders that got people killed. I'm not saying I'm smarter. I'm saying I was right and he was wrong, and 13 men are alive because I ignored him. Hendricks studied her. And if you had been wrong, if that soil anomaly had been a shadow, if the air support had killed the team you were trying to save? But I wasn't wrong. Riley met his eyes. And they're not dead. This time. Hendricks leaned against the desk. This time you were right. But what about the young corporal who hears your story and thinks she can override her CO? What about the breakdown of discipline when everyone thinks their judgment is better than the chain of command? You may have saved lives last night, but the precedent you set could cost lives tomorrow. Riley had no answer, because he was right. Military discipline was not about being correct. It was about following the rules, and she had shattered them. Where's Master Chief Dalton? Riley asked, changing the subject. Is he alive? Hendricks's expression softened slightly. He's in surgery, lost a lot of blood, but the doctors think he'll make it. He's tough. I need to see him. That's not possible. You're confined to quarters pending completion of the inquiry, no contact with potential witnesses. He's not a witness. Riley stopped, swallowed emotion. He knew my father. He's the only connection I have left to that part of my life. Please. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed. I'll see what I can do, but no promises. And if you get to see him, you don't discuss the operation. You don't discuss your decisions. Understood? Understood. Good. Hendricks walked to the door. The MPs are going to escort you to transient quarters. You'll stay there until the inquiry is complete. Probably 48 to 72 hours. If you need anything, ask them. What about my rifle? Riley asked. The TAC-50, it needs to be cleaned, maintained. It's evidence. It'll be properly cared for. But you won't be getting it back until this is resolved. Riley stood, feeling unsteady. On the mountain, the enemy was clear. The objective simple. Survive. Protect your team. Win. But here, in this plywood building, the enemy was invisible and the objective murky, and winning might look exactly like losing. One more thing, Hendricks said as she reached the door. Off the record. Riley turned. What you did up there was extraordinary. Hendricks' voice was quiet, almost gentle. I've read the preliminary reports. I've seen the distances, the conditions. What you accomplished should not have been possible, but that's exactly the problem. When people do impossible things, it makes everyone else uncomfortable. It raises questions about what else might be possible if we stop following the rules. And the military runs on rules, not on miracles. So even though you saved those men, even though you did the right thing, you're probably going to be punished for it. Because the system can't allow heroes who don't follow orders. It opens too many doors that need to stay closed. Riley stared at him. So what am I supposed to do? Except that sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. That's the real lesson of war. Not that courage matters, but that it often doesn't matter enough. He closed the door. Riley stood in the hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead. MPs waiting to escort her to her cage. She thought about her grandfather, about the Medal of Honor in a shoebox because looking at it hurt too much. She thought about her father, about how saving Master Chief Dalton in Mogadishu had not saved him from the demons that chased him home. She thought about her brother, about how doing everything right had not been enough to keep him alive. And she thought about the cartridge in her pocket, the one from Mogadishu, the one her father had never fired, the one that represented patience and discipline in knowing when not to pull the trigger. But her father had also known when to pull the trigger, had known that sometimes the only choice was between bad options and worse options, and you picked the one you could live with and hope that living with it did not destroy you. The transient quarters were a 20 by 10 room with 2 bunks, a wall locker, and a window looking onto the runway. One of the MPs unlocked the door and gestured for Riley to enter. The other handed her a bottle of water and an MRE. "Someone will bring dinner in a few hours," he said. "Latrine is down the hall. You need anything else, knock on the door. We'll be right outside." "Am I a prisoner?" Riley asked. The MP hesitated. "You're being protected. There's a difference." "Is there?" Riley took the water and MRE and walked into the room. The door closed behind her with a solid click that sounded exactly like a lock, even though technically it was not. Technically, she was free. Riley sat on the lower bunk and stared at the wall. She should sleep. Her body was screaming for it. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the crosshairs, saw the thermal blooms of men who had been alive and then were not because she had squeezed a trigger. She pulled out her brother's letter, the one she had read so many times the paper had gone soft. "Riles, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. The handwriting was terrible, all jagged capitals. Don't be sad. Don't be angry. I did what I was supposed to do. I stood between the bad things and the people I love. That's all any of us can do." But was that true? Was standing between bad things and good people really all you could do? Or was there supposed to be more? The door opened without warning. Riley jumped to her feet, hand reaching for a sidearm she no longer carried. But it was just one of the MPs, and behind him was a medic in scrubs still spattered with blood. "You have 5 minutes, the MP said. "Then she has to get back to the hospital." The medic stepped inside. She was young, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes. "I'm Captain Reeves. I was part of the surgical team working on Chief Dalton." "Is he alive?" Riley asked. "He's alive, critical but stable. We got the bleeding stopped, repaired the artery. He's going to need more surgeries, and the recovery will be long, but he should make it." Reeves paused. "He asked to see you." "Well, he can't talk yet because of the intubation, but he wrote your name on a piece of paper and wouldn't rest until I promised to find you." "Can I see him?" "That's why I'm here. But we have to go now. He's still in recovery and visiting hours are over. I'm bending rules I shouldn't bend." Riley followed her out of the room, past the MPs who looked uncertain. Reeves walked with the confidence of someone too tired to care about regulations, who had spent 6 hours saving a life and was not about to be intimidated. The hospital was converted shipping containers and prefab buildings that smelled of antiseptic and suffering. Reeves led her through hallways to a recovery room where half a dozen beds held men in various states of damage. Dalton was in the corner, his bed surrounded by monitors that beeped and hummed. He was pale, almost gray, with tubes coming out of his mouth and arms and chest. His eyes were closed. For a terrible moment, Riley thought she was too late. Then his eyes opened, pale blue and exhausted but alive, aware. "Hey, Chief." Riley pulled a chair close and sat down. "You scared me." Dalton tried to speak, but the tube prevented it. He made a frustrated sound and reached for a small whiteboard on the table. His hand shook as he wrote, "Did good." Riley felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. "You did good too, Chief. You kept us together when it mattered." Dalton shook his head slightly, wincing. He erased the board and wrote again, "You saved us all." "Wheeler doesn't see it that way," Riley said quietly. "He's saying I violated regulations, that I should be court-martialed for insubordination." Dalton's expression hardened. He wrote with more force, "Wheeler is coward. You are soldier." "I'm not sure the difference matters to the people investigating me." Dalton erased and wrote again, slower, making sure each letter was clear. "Your father saved me. Not because Reg said to, because it was right. You saved team, same reason. That is legacy." Riley took the board from his hands and set it aside. She leaned forward and very gently took his hand, careful of the IV lines. "My father saved you in Mogadishu and then killed himself because the weight of it was too much. How do I know I'm not going to end up the same way?" Dalton squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. Then he released it and reached for the board again. You are stronger. You have people who need you. Team needs you. I need you. Don't let bureaucrats destroy what your father built. What did he build? Riley asked. What did any of us build except more graves? Dalton wiped the board clean. He hesitated, the marker hovering. Then he wrote 3 words. Hope, courage, future. Riley stared at the words. She wanted to believe them. Wanted to think that climbing a cliff and making impossible shots had created something other than more death and trauma. But hope felt like a lie. Courage felt like another word for stupidity. And the future felt like it was being written by Lieutenant Wheeler in an office designed to punish people for doing the right thing the wrong way. Time's up. Captain Reeves appeared in the doorway. He needs to rest. And you need to get back before someone realizes I took you off base without authorization. Riley stood. She looked down at Dalton. Thank you, Chief, for everything. Dalton nodded. He picked up the marker one more time and wrote the last thing he would say to her before exhaustion pulled him under. Cross family pays debts. You paid yours. Now live. The walk back to quarters was quiet. Riley's mind spun with too many thoughts. She thought about what Colonel Hendricks had said, about how extraordinary actions made people uncomfortable, about how the system needed rules more than it needed heroes. But she also thought about what Dalton had written, about hope and courage and future, about the difference between following regulations and doing what was right, about how sometimes those things aligned and sometimes they were at war, and choosing between them was how you discovered who you really were. Back in her room, Riley lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. She just lay there, listening to helicopters taking off and landing, the endless cycle of violence and extraction. Somewhere in the administrative building, building, Lieutenant Wheeler was building a case against her. Somewhere in an operating room, surgeons were keeping Master Chief Dalton alive. Somewhere in the mountains, the bodies of men she had killed were cooling in the thin air. And somewhere in West Virginia, her mother was waking up to another day of not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. Riley touched the Mogadishu cartridge in her pocket. The brass was warm from her body heat. She thought about her father loading this round, chambering it, waiting with his finger on the trigger for 6 hours while the enemy waited. She thought about him choosing not to fire, choosing patience over action, choosing to bring Master Chief Dalton home alive instead of killing the men who threatened them both. And she wondered if that choice had saved Dalton's life or destroyed her father's. If there was a difference between a hero and a man too broken to keep living. If the cost of doing the right thing was always more than you could afford to pay. The next morning, a knock came at the door. Riley opened it to find one of the MPs standing with Staff Sergeant Marcus Hayes on crutches behind him. You have 5 minutes, the MP said, then stepped back. Marcus hobbled into the room. His wounded leg was bandaged, his face pale, but his eyes were clear. I've been resting for 12 hours. Marcus shifted his weight. I'll rest when I'm dead. Right now, I needed to see you, to say something before they take you wherever they're taking you. They're not taking me anywhere, Riley said. I'm just being investigated. Bullshit. Marcus's voice was flat. Wheeler is pushing for a court-martial. He's got friends at higher levels. People who think discipline matters more than results. He's going to burn you if he can. Riley sat on the bunk, then he burns me. I made my choices. I'll live with the consequences. That's not why I'm here. Marcus leaned forward. The team wants you to know something. We took a vote, all of us who were there, everyone who came back because you climbed that cliff. A vote on what? On whether what you did was right. On whether we'd want you with us again. On whether you're one of us or just some kid who got lucky. Marcus paused. It was unanimous, Cross. Every single one of us said the same thing. You're a SEAL in everything but the trident. You think like us. You fight like us. You refuse to quit like us. And if they try to destroy you for that, then they're destroying the wrong person. Riley felt something loosen in her chest. That means a lot, more than you know. It should mean everything, Marcus said firmly, because here's what I learned on that mountain. Rank is just a number on a collar. Experience is just time and service. The only thing that actually matters when the bullets are flying is whether the person next to you will do what needs doing. And you did what needed doing, every single time, without hesitation, without fear, without worrying about whether it would cost you your career. It's going to cost me my career, Riley said quietly. Then the system is broken. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Riley. Before he left, he turned back. One more thing, Cross. That shot you made on the commander, the one through the cracked scope at 1,200 meters in variable wind? I've been a sniper for 8 years. I couldn't have made that shot with perfect equipment and unlimited time. What you did up there wasn't just good. It was impossible. And impossible is what heroes do. Don't let them take that away from you. The door closed. Riley sat alone, holding the cloth-wrapped object. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a sealed trident pin, the genuine article, the eagle with its anchor and trident and pistol, the symbol of the most elite warriors. It was scratched and worn, carried through deployments. Underneath was a note in Marcus's handwriting. You earned this on the mountain. The Navy might not give it to you officially, but we know what we saw. We know what you are. You're one of us, always. Riley held the trident in her palm, feeling the weight of it. This was not just metal. This was acceptance. This was respect. This was a community that did not care about her age or gender or rank, only about what she had done when it mattered most. She pinned it to the inside of her pocket, next to the Mogadishu cartridge and her brother's letter. 3 pieces of metal and paper that weighed nothing and everything. 3 reminders of who she was and where she came from and what she was willing to pay. Riley touched her brother's letter one more time. Then she lay down and tried to sleep. But sleep would not come easily. Not tonight, not with the weight of what was coming pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. She sat up and pulled out the 3 talismans from her pocket, laying them on the small table. The Mogadishu cartridge, tarnished with age. The letter from Ethan, worn soft from countless readings. And now the sealed trident, scratched and real. She thought about the mathematics of legacy. 3 generations. 3 wars. Her grandfather on Iwo Jima with 3 fingers blown off, earning a medal he kept in a shoebox. He never talked about the war. When Riley was 8 and asked him what it was like, he had looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed very old and said only this. It was loud. Then he had walked into the barn and she had heard him crying. Her father had followed during the Gulf War in '91, had been 22 when Saddam invaded Kuwait. He had killed men in the desert, had learned that human beings at 800 meters looked like dots. Then came Mogadishu in '93, Black Hawk Down, where he crawled through hell to save Master Chief Dalton. He came home with 87 confirmed kills and a soul that was eating itself from the inside. Riley remembered how he would sit at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., staring at nothing. How he would flinch at car backfires. How he finally went into the barn when Riley was 16 and put a pistol in his mouth because the silence had become too loud. Her brother Ethan had been 19 when their father died. He had found him in the barn. He enlisted 6 months later, said someone had to finish what Dad started. But he had not come home. An IED outside Sangin had turned him into memory and a folded flag. And now Riley, 19 years old, the last of the cross line, the last chance to prove that this legacy was something other than a curse, that you could stand between the bad things and the good people and survive with your soul intact. That courage did not have to cost you everything. But what was her soul worth now? She had killed men on that mountain. How many, she was not sure. The commander, wounded but probably dead by now. The insurgents on the cliff trail. Others she might have hit with those impossible shots across impossible distances. Men with families. Men with mothers who would weep when the news came. Men whose children would grow up without fathers, just like she had. And maybe those children would pick up rifles and come looking for revenge, and the cycle would continue forever. World without end. Amen. She waited for the guilt to come, waited for the horror, waited for her humanity to reassert itself and make her feel something about the taking of human life. It did not come. Not yet. Maybe it would later. Maybe in nightmares. Maybe in the quiet moments years from now when she was old and the war was distant and she had time to remember. But right now, in this room, with the knowledge that Master Chief Dalton was alive and Marcus Hayes was alive and the men of SEAL Team Echo had come home because she had climbed a cliff and refused to quit, she felt only a cold satisfaction. A sense that she had done what needed doing, that she had paid the debt her family owed to the uniform and to the flag and to the abstract concept of freedom that men died for, even though freedom was never free and the price was always higher than advertised. Tomorrow, the reckoning would come. Lieutenant Wheeler would present his case. Colonel Hendricks would weigh the evidence. The machinery of military justice would grind on, indifferent to individual stories, concerned only with regulations and precedent in the maintenance of order. She would probably lose, probably be reduced in rank, maybe discharged, maybe face a court-martial that would follow her for the rest of her life. The system could not allow a corporal to be right when a lieutenant was wrong, could not allow extraordinary actions that made ordinary people uncomfortable, could not permit miracles that suggested the rules were optional. But she had the trident, hidden in her pocket where no one could see it, unofficial and unsanctioned, and worth more than any piece of metal the Marine Corps could offer. She had the respect of men who knew what she had done, who had been there, who understood that sometimes the book was wrong and the only right choice was the one that kept your brothers alive. That would have to be enough. That would be her medal, her recognition, her proof that she had done something that mattered. Riley picked up the Mogadishu cartridge and held it up to the light. The brass caught the fluorescent glow from overhead, turning it golden, making it look almost holy. Her father had carried this round for 20 years after the battle, had kept it as a reminder of the shot he did not take, the moment when patience had mattered more than violence. She wondered what he would think of her now. Would he be proud that she had saved lives? Or would he be terrified that she was walking the same path he had walked, the path that led from the battlefield to the barn, from courage to despair, from surviving to giving up? She would never know. The dead kept their opinions to themselves. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Riley quickly pocketed the talismans and stood. It was late, well past when the MPs should have allowed visitors. She opened the door cautiously. One of the MPs stood there looking apologetic. "Sorry to disturb you, Corporal, but there's someone here who says it's important. Says he won't leave until he talks to you." Behind the MP, Riley could see a figure in a wheelchair. Even in the dim hallway light, she recognized the gray beard, the pale blue eyes. Master Chief Dalton. He should not have been here. Should have been in the ICU, intubated, sedated, monitored. But here he was, the tube removed from his throat, his neck bandaged, his face the color of old paper, but his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who had something to say and would not rest until he said it. "Let him in," Riley said. "Ma'am, I don't think the MP started." "Let him in." Riley's voice carried command despite her rank. "He came all the way from the hospital. Whatever he has to say, I need to hear it." The MP hesitated, then stepped aside. Dalton wheeled himself into the small room. Riley closed the door behind him. "Chief, you should be in bed. You just had surgery." Dalton's voice was a rasp, rough from the intubation, but clear enough. "Been in bed. Bed is boring. Needed to see you. Needed to make sure you understood something." "Understood what?" "That your father didn't fail." Dalton leaned forward in the wheelchair, his eyes locked on hers. "Everyone thinks he failed. Everyone thinks he was weak, that he gave up. But they're wrong. He fought for 20 years. 20 years carrying the weight of Mogadishu. 20 years seeing the faces of men he killed. 20 years wondering if saving me was worth what it cost him. That's not weakness. That's endurance. That's strength beyond what most people can imagine." Riley felt her throat tighten. Then why did he do it? Why did he quit? He didn't quit. Dalton's voice was gentle but firm. He lasted 20 years past when the war should have killed him. 20 years past when he wanted to die. He gave you and your brother almost 2 decades he didn't have to give. He loved you that much. And when he couldn't fight anymore, when the weight finally crushed him, he made it quick so you wouldn't have to watch him suffer. That's not quitting. That's a tactical retreat when the position is no longer tenable. Riley felt tears on her face but did not move to wipe them away. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there." Dalton reached into his pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was there 3 days before he died. He called me, asked me to come visit. We sat in that barn and he told me everything, told me he was tired, told me the ghosts were getting louder, told me he couldn't do it anymore. And he gave me this. He asked me to hold on to it until you were old enough to understand, until you had been to war yourself and could comprehend what it meant." He handed Riley the paper. She unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a letter, in her father's handwriting. "Riley girl, if you're reading this, it means Chief Dalton decided you were ready. It means you've probably done something brave and stupid and are wondering if the cost was worth it. I can't answer that for you. Only you can decide what your courage is worth. But I can tell you this. I don't regret Mogadishu. I don't regret saving the chief. I don't regret any shot I took or didn't take. What I regret is not being strong enough to carry it all. Not being tough enough to live with what I did. That's my failure. Not the war, not the killing, but the coming home and not knowing how to be the man you and Ethan and your mother needed. So if you're reading this, it means you're probably facing a choice between doing the right thing and doing the safe thing, between following orders and following your conscience. And if you chose the hard road, if you chose to save people even when it cost you something, then I'm proud of you, prouder than I have words to say. Don't let my ending define your beginning. Don't let my weakness become your destiny. You're stronger than me. You're better than me. You're the best thing I ever made. And if you take nothing else from this letter, take this. Live. Fight when you have to. Rest when you can. But above all, live. Don't just survive. Don't just endure. Live with purpose, enjoying the knowledge that doing the right thing is its own reward, even when the world punishes you for it. You're a cross. We don't quit. We don't break. We stand until we can't stand anymore, and then we stand a little longer. But when the time comes to rest, we rest without shame. I lasted as long as I could. I gave what I had to give. Now it's your turn. Make it count. I love you, Riles. I always did. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. But I'm not sorry for the years we had. Be fierce, be brave, be alive. Dad. Riley read the letter twice, then a third time, feeling something shift in her chest, some long-held tension finally releasing its grip. Her father had not been weak. He had been tired. There was a difference. And he had loved her enough to hold on for 20 years past when he wanted to let go. That was not failure. That was heroism of a different kind. Thank you, Riley whispered, looking up at Dalton, for keeping this, for bringing it to me. Your father was my brother. Dalton's voice was rough with emotion, not by blood, but by bond. And you're his daughter, which makes you my family. Wheeler can try to destroy you. The system can try to break you. But you're not alone in this fight. You've got the team. You've got me. And you've got a legacy that's about more than just shooting straight. It's about standing up when others won't. About doing the hard thing because it's right. That's what your father did for me in Mogadishu. That's what you did on that mountain. And that's what I'm going to do for you in that inquiry. Riley felt something like hope stir in her chest. What are you going to do? I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it. And if they don't like it, well. Dalton smiled, a fierce expression that made him look dangerous despite the wheelchair and the bandages. I'm retiring anyway. What are they going to do? Fire me? He wheeled himself to the door, then paused. Get some sleep, Cross. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day, but you'll survive it, because that's what your people do. The door closed. Riley was alone again. But the loneliness felt different now. Less like isolation and more like solitude. Less like abandonment and more like preparation. She folded her father's letter and placed it with the other talismans. 4 pieces now. The Mogadishu cartridge. Ethan's letter. The seal trident. And now this final message from a man who had fought his war and lost, but had made sure his daughter understood that losing was not the same as failing, that sometimes endurance was measured not in victories, but in how long you could carry an impossible weight before your knees finally buckled. Riley lay down on the bunk. This time when she closed her eyes, sleep came quickly. And in her dreams, she was not in West Virginia. She was standing on a mountain at sunrise, and her father was beside her, and her grandfather, and her brother. All the crossed men who had gone to war, all the ghosts who had carried rifles and killed at distance and paid prices they should not have had to pay. And they were smiling, not with joy, but with understanding, with recognition, with the knowledge that she had done what they had done, had stood where they had stood, had made the same impossible choices and survived to tell about it. Tomorrow, the reckoning would come. Tomorrow, she would face the system that wanted to punish her for being right. Tomorrow, Lieutenant Wheeler would try to destroy her career, and Colonel Hendricks would try to explain why extraordinary was dangerous. But tonight, she slept. And in her sleep, she was at peace, because she had done what needed doing, because 13 men were alive who would have been dead, because the Cross family legacy was not about medals or recognition or official sanction. It was about standing, about refusing to break, about living with the consequences of courage. And she was still standing. Whatever came next, she would face it the way her grandfather had faced Iwo Jima, the way her father had faced Mogadishu, the way her brother had faced every day in Afghanistan before the IED. She would face it standing, with her eyes open, with her conscience clear. And that finally was enough. The hearing room at Marine Corps Base Quantico was smaller than Riley Cross had imagined. She had pictured something grand, something cinematic. Instead, it was a windowless box with fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly and beige walls that had witnessed too many careers ending in quiet shame. Riley sat at a single metal table, her dress blue uniform crisp and perfect. Behind her sat Captain Maria Santos, a JAG officer assigned to her defense. Across the narrow aisle sat Lieutenant Bryce Wheeler, his uniform equally perfect, his face carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed justice and his opinion were the same thing. At the front of the room, behind an elevated desk, sat Colonel Frank Hendricks. A stack of files sat before him, thick with reports and statements and the paperwork that turned human decisions into administrative consequences. "This is not a court-martial," Hendricks said. "This is an Article 15 hearing to determine if Corporal Cross violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice during combat operations in Afghanistan. The charges are insubordination, reckless endangerment, and violation of rules of engagement. Corporal Cross, do you understand the charges?" "I understand them, sir," Riley's voice was steady. "And do you understand that you have the right to refuse this Article 15 proceeding and demand a court-martial?" "I understand, sir, and I choose to proceed with the Article 15. Hendricks nodded. "Very well. Lieutenant Wheeler, you may present the government's case." Wheeler stood. "Sir, the facts are clear and undisputed. On the night of October 15th, 2009, during Operation Steel Talon, Corporal Cross violated direct orders on no fewer than 5 separate occasions. She overrode flight operations during insertion. She abandoned her assigned position during contact. She engaged targets without proper clearance. She called in danger-close air support that nearly resulted in friendly casualties. And she disregarded my direct order to stand down. Each of these actions, taken individually, would constitute grounds for disciplinary action. Taken together, they represent a pattern of insubordination that undermines the very foundation of military discipline. But, sir, I want to acknowledge that Corporal Cross's intentions may have been good. She believed her actions would save lives, and in a narrow tactical sense, she may have been correct about some of her assessments. But good intentions do not excuse violations of the chain of command. If we allow junior personnel to disobey orders whenever they disagree, we invite chaos. That is not a military that can win wars." Wheeler sat down. He looked satisfied. Hendricks looked at Riley. "Corporal Cross, you will have an opportunity to respond, but first I want to hear from the witnesses." "Lieutenant Wheeler, call your first witness." "Sir, the government calls Master Chief James Dalton." The door opened. Master Chief Dalton entered the room, walking with only a slight limp. His neck was still bandaged, but the color had returned to his face. He wore his dress uniform, the Navy Cross prominent among a chest full of ribbons. He moved to the witness chair with careful precision. Hendricks administered the oath. Dalton raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. He sat. "Master Chief, you were the team leader of SEAL Team Echo on the night in question?" "I was." "And Corporal Cross was attached to your team as augment sniper support?" "She was." "Can you describe Corporal Cross's behavior during the mission? Specifically, did she follow your orders?" Dalton looked at Wheeler, then at Riley, then back at Wheeler. "She followed my orders when my orders were correct." He said it quietly, like he was reading a weather report. Wheeler blinked. "I'm sorry, Chief, I don't understand. Did she or did she not follow orders?" "She followed the mission. She kept the team alive. That was the order that mattered." "With respect, Chief, that's not what I asked. Did she follow the specific tactical orders given to her?" "She did not. She violated your orders multiple times. You're absolutely correct about that." Riley felt something cold settle in her chest. "Thank you, Chief. Can you tell us what would have happened if she had followed orders? If she had not redirected the helicopter?" Dalton looked at Wheeler for a long moment. "We would have landed on an IED. The Chinook would have been destroyed. Everyone aboard would have died. All 13 of us. According to your report, the IED was not confirmed until after landing. Corporal Cross made the decision based on a thermal anomaly. She could have been wrong, but she wasn't. But she could have been. She made a judgment call that overrode the pilot's instruments. If she had been wrong, we would have landed safely 50 meters away and the mission would have proceeded. But she wasn't wrong, she was right. And because she was right, we lived." Wheeler changed tactics. "Let's discuss the air support incident. Corporal Cross called in danger-close bombing while you and your team were still within the minimum safe distance. Is that correct?" "The enemy was dug into positions on the ridgeline. They had clear fields of fire. We were pinned down. My team was taking casualties. The only way to break the engagement was to bring the mountain down on them. Did you authorize Corporal Cross to call in that strike? No, I was unconscious at the time. Arterial bleed from a neck wound. So she made the decision on her own. She made the decision that kept my men alive. Dalton leaned forward slightly. Lieutenant Wheeler, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've served with men who followed orders perfectly and got everyone killed. And I've served with people who broke every rule in the book and brought everyone home. Corporal Cross brought everyone home. In my business, that's the only metric that matters. Chief, with all due respect, you're not on trial here. Corporal Cross is. And the question is not whether her actions saved lives. The question is whether she had the authority to make those decisions. No, she didn't have the authority. She was a corporal. By the book, she violated every rule we have. He paused. But let me tell you something about books, Lieutenant. Books don't bleed. Books don't die. Books don't watch their friends get cut in half by machine gun fire because someone decided that following procedure was more important than adapting to the situation. Wheeler opened his mouth to object, but Dalton continued. 20 years ago, I was in Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993. Black Hawk down. I took shrapnel through my intestines, and I was lying in a crater waiting to die when a Marine sniper crawled 500 meters through a field of fire to pull me out. That Marine was Daniel Cross, Corporal Cross's father. And let me tell you what Daniel Cross did that day. He disobeyed direct orders to fall back. He left his assigned position without authorization. He violated minimum safe distance for fire support 3 times. By every metric you're using to judge his daughter, he should have been court-martialed. But instead, he saved my life. He saved 14 other Americans that day by making decisions that were tactically correct, even though they were procedurally wrong. Dalton looked directly at Wheeler. Riley Cross is her father's daughter. She saw the situation. She made the call. She violated procedure to achieve the objective. And if you want to punish her for that, go ahead. But understand what you're really doing. You're punishing someone for being competent, for being brave, for choosing mission success over career preservation. The room was silent. Hendricks cleared his throat. Thank you, Chief. You're excused. Dalton stood. As he passed Riley, he reached out and squeezed her shoulder. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it said everything. Wheeler stood again. Sir, I'd like to call Staff Sergeant Marcus Hayes. Marcus entered on crutches, his wounded legs still healing. He settled into the witness chair with careful movement. The oath was administered. Staff Sergeant Hayes, you're the organic sniper for SEAL Team Echo, correct? Correct. Can you describe her demeanor, her decision-making process? Marcus looked at Wheeler, then at Riley. She was scared out of her mind. Anybody could see that. 19 years old, first real combat, separated from the team, pinned down, taking fire. She should have frozen. Most people would have frozen, but she didn't. She climbed an 80-meter cliff face in the dark with a 26-pound rifle on her back and no climbing gear. Halfway up, she almost fell. A rock gave way and she was hanging by one hand over a 300-foot drop. But she didn't let go. She didn't quit. And when she reached the top, she engaged targets without authorization. She engaged targets that were killing us. There was a sniper in a hide position that I couldn't see from my angle. He was punching rounds through the compound walls. He'd already hit me. Through the wall. I didn't even see the shot coming. He was systematically destroying our cover, and there was nothing we could do about it. But Corporal Cross could see him? From her elevated position, yes. She had the angle, and she took the shot. Through a damaged optic? The scope had a crack across it from the earlier RPG blast. At 1,200 meters, with a cracked scope, in variable wind, with no spotter, she made a hit. Not on the sniper. The angle was wrong for a body shot, but she destroyed his optic, shattered his scope, took him out of the fight without killing him. He paused. I've been a sniper for 8 years. I have hundreds of confirmed kills, and I could not have made that shot, not under those conditions. What she did up there was impossible. And if you want to punish her for it, you go ahead. But everybody in this room knows that if she hadn't been there, if she hadn't done the impossible, Team Echo would have been wiped out. Wheeler sat down without another word. Hendricks looked at Marcus. Staff Sergeant, you're excused, and thank you for your service. Marcus stood. As he passed Riley, he stopped completely, turned to face her, and rendered a perfect salute. Riley, still seated, could only watch as the SEAL she had once thought hated her offered her the respect reserved for superior officers. Marcus held the salute for 3 seconds. Then he dropped it and left the room. Hendricks removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired. Does the government have any other witnesses? Wheeler shook his head. No, sir. Hendricks turned to Captain Santos. Does the defense wish to call any witnesses? Yes, sir. The defense calls Corporal Riley Cross. Riley stood and walked to the witness chair. Her hands were shaking. She forced them to be still. She raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. She sat. Corporal Cross, you've heard the testimony. You've heard the charges. I want to hear from you. In your own words, why did you disobey orders? Riley took a breath. She had prepared an answer with Captain Santos. A careful answer that acknowledged mistakes while emphasizing good intentions. She did not give that answer. Sir, I disobeyed orders because my orders were wrong. The room went very still. Wheeler half rose from his chair. Sir, this is exactly... Sit down, Lieutenant. Hendricks did not raise his voice, but Wheeler sat. Explain. Lieutenant Wheeler ordered the helicopter to land on an IED. I saw the thermal signature. I saw the disturbed Earth. I knew what it was. And when I reported it, I was told my assessment was wrong. I had 2 choices, sir. Follow orders and watch everyone die, or override the order and face consequences later. I chose consequences over corpses. And the cliff climb? Why didn't you wait for support? There was no support, sir. We were jammed, cut off. The enemy was entrenched and picking us apart. Master Chief Dalton was bleeding out. Staff Sergeant Hayes was hit. The compound walls were failing. If I waited, they would die. All of them. So I decided to do my job. My job as a sniper is to eliminate threats to my team at long range. There was a threat, I eliminated it. By climbing a cliff in the dark and making an impossible shot through damaged equipment, it wasn't impossible, sir. It was difficult. There's a difference. Do you regret your actions? Riley considered the question. No, sir. I don't regret keeping people alive. But I do regret that the system sees that as a crime instead of as my job. You understand that military discipline requires following orders even when you disagree? I understand that, sir. And I also understand that following bad orders gets good people killed. And I swore an oath to protect and defend. Not to follow orders, not to preserve my career, but to protect and defend. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic. You believe Lieutenant Wheeler was a domestic enemy? No, sir. I believe Lieutenant Wheeler was a good officer who made a bad call. And I believe I was a corporal who made a necessary call. And now you have to decide which matters more, whether I followed procedure or whether I brought the team home. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. You're dismissed, Corporal. Riley returned to her seat. Captain Santos gave her a look that was equal parts admiration and horror. Hendricks spent 5 minutes reviewing the files. The room was silent. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked up. I've reviewed the evidence, I've heard the testimony, and I've considered the arguments from both sides. Corporal Cross, you violated direct orders from a superior officer. You overrode tactical decisions. You called in fire support without authorization. These are facts. Riley felt her chest tighten. But I have also considered the context, the outcomes, the lives saved by your actions, and I've considered what it means to hold you accountable for being right when the system was wrong. The military runs on discipline, on order, on the understanding that when orders are given, they will be followed. If every soldier made independent decisions, we would not have a military, we would have chaos. He paused. But the military also runs on competence, on initiative, on the understanding that the mission matters more than the procedure. And sometimes the gap between what the book says and what the situation requires is the difference between success and failure, between survival and death. Hendricks put his glasses back on. I find that Corporal Cross did violate the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charges of insubordination and unauthorized engagement are sustained. However, I also find that her actions, while procedurally incorrect, were tactically sound and resulted in mission success and preservation of American lives. Therefore, my judgment is as follows. Corporal Cross will receive a punitive letter of reprimand that will remain in her permanent record. She will forfeit 7 days' pay, and she will be separated from the Marine Corps with an honorable discharge. Riley heard the words, but they did not make sense. Honorable discharge. That meant she was being kicked out, but it also meant she was not being convicted. Wheeler stood. Sir, with respect, a letter of reprimand is insufficient. My decision is final, Lieutenant. You may appeal, but this hearing is concluded. He looked at Riley one more time. Corporal Cross, you're a damn fine Marine. You're also a nightmare for command structure. The Marine Corps needs people like you, but it also needs to maintain discipline. I cannot condone what you did, but I cannot condemn it either. So I'm giving you an honorable discharge and hoping that whatever you do next, you bring the same courage and competence you showed on that mountain. He stood. This hearing is adjourned. 3 weeks later, Riley stood in Arlington National Cemetery wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 3 years. Jeans, a flannel shirt, boots that were not combat boots. She felt strange without the uniform, lighter, smaller, like she had left part of herself behind at Quantico when she handed in her rifle and her dog tags and walked out of the armory for the last time. The cemetery was quiet in the way that only places of the dead can be quiet. Not silent. There were birds and wind and the distant hum of traffic on Memorial Drive, but quiet in a way that made you lower your voice automatically, that made you walk softer, that reminded you that this ground was different from other ground, that the grass here grew on top of stories that would never be finished, conversations that would never be completed, futures that had ended before they could begin. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to burn through the autumn haze that hung over the Potomac. The air smelled of cut grass and rain from the night before, and something else, something Riley could not name, but recognized from her childhood visits here with her father. The smell of memory, maybe. The smell of grief that had been carried so long it had become part of the landscape. She walked the geometric rows of white headstones, each one identical, each one a life reduced to name and rank and dates that seemed too close together. The uniformity was intentional, her father had told her once. In death, we are all equal. Colonel or private, hero or coward, we all get the same stone, the same plot, the same final resting place. Democracy, he had said, tastes like dirt and looks like marble. Riley found the section she was looking for, Section 60, where the newest dead lived, where the boys from Iraq and Afghanistan were laid in neat rows, their stones so white they hurt to look at in the morning sun. Not yet weathered by decades of rain and wind and the passage of years that would eventually turn them the same gray as their grandfather's stones from World War II. She found his name. Corporal Ethan James Cross, 1987-2009. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, beloved son, devoted brother. Riley knelt in the wet grass, feeling the moisture soak through her jeans. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small brass object, a single cartridge, .50 caliber. The metal was tarnished with age, the primer slightly corroded, the case mouth still crimped around a bullet that had never been fired, would never be fired, would spend eternity as potential energy that would never become kinetic. The Mogadishu cartridge. Her father had carried this round for 20 years after October 3rd, 1993, the day the Black Hawks went down, the day 18 Americans died in a city that was supposed to welcome them as liberators, but instead turned into a killing ground, where helicopters fell from the sky and Rangers fought in streets they could not pronounce for reasons they did not fully understand. Her father had chambered this round when he crawled through fire to save Master Chief Dalton, had kept his finger on the trigger for 6 hours while the enemy waited and he waited and death waited with patience that only death can afford. He had never fired it. The enemy had never rushed the position. The medevac helicopter had come. He had ejected the unfired cartridge and kept it, carried it in his pocket for 2 decades like a talisman, like a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was not pull the trigger, that patience was a weapon sharper than any bullet. But he had also known when to pull the trigger, had killed 4 men in 30 seconds to cover the helicopter's landing, had made shots that saved 14 American lives, including Dalton's. And then he had come home, and the war had followed him, and 20 years later, he had gone into the barn and put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger one final time. Riley placed the Mogadishu cartridge on top of Ethan's headstone. The brass caught the morning light and glowed like a small sun, like captured fire, like hope that had been stored in metal for so long it had forgotten what hope felt like. "This is yours now, Ethan," Riley whispered to the stone. "Dad carried it through Mogadishu. I carried it through Afghanistan, and now you can carry it wherever you are. Keep it safe. Don't fire it unless you have to. But if you have to, don't hesitate. She heard footsteps behind her, multiple sets of footsteps, moving in the careful rhythm of people who knew how to walk quietly, how to approach without startling, how to be present without being intrusive. Riley turned and saw them. Master Chief James Dalton, walking without a cane now, his neck scar barely visible above his civilian shirt collar. The limp was almost gone. In another month it would disappear entirely, and the only evidence that he had nearly died would be the dreams he did not talk about and the way he sometimes touched his neck unconsciously, checking to make sure the artery was still intact, that blood was still flowing, that he was still among the living. Marcus Hayes on crutches, his wounded leg still healing, but improving every day. The doctor said he would walk again without assistance by Christmas. They said he might even run again, though probably not the 6-minute miles he had run before the bullet punched through the compound wall and shattered his femur and reminded him that walls were not cover, walls were concealment, and concealment only worked until the enemy decided to shoot through it. Jake Morrison in a wheelchair, his injured leg elevated, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting your own body, from trying to heal when healing was harder than the injury. But he was alive. The arterial bleed had been controlled. The infection that followed had been beaten. He would walk again, maybe not run, maybe not jump out of helicopters, but he would walk, and walking was enough. The other members of SEAL Team Echo stood in a loose formation behind them, all in civilian clothes, all looking slightly uncomfortable in the way that warriors always looked uncomfortable when they were not in uniform, when they could not hide behind rank and ribbons and the professional distance that came with wearing the costume. "What are you doing here?" Riley asked, though she already knew. She knew because these men did not do anything without a reason, did not show up anywhere without a mission, did not gather unless there was purpose. "We couldn't let you do this alone," Dalton said simply. He gestured at the headstone. "Your brother, your father, your grandfather. The Cross family has bled enough, has stood alone enough. We figured it was time for that to stop." "You don't have to," Riley started. "We know," Marcus interrupted, shifting his weight on the crutches. "But we wanted to. The team voted. Unanimous. We're here because you're one of us. Because what you did up there," he gestured vaguely at the sky, at the mountains that were not visible from here, but that they all remembered, that they would all carry forever in the spaces between their thoughts. "What you did earned you a place at this table, and we don't let our own stand alone. Not at Arlington, not anywhere." Dalton reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. The cloth was old, military green, the kind of cotton canvas that had been used for shelter halves in wars past, that had been cut and sewn and repurposed a dozen times until it was more stitches than original fabric. He handed it to Riley. "Open it." Riley unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a medal, but not one she recognized. It was a Navy cross, the distinctive bronze cross suspended from a blue ribbon with a white stripe down the center. But something was wrong. The medal had been modified, engraved. On the back, in letters so small she had to squint to read them, were words. "For Corporal Riley Cross, United States Marine Corps, Afghanistan 2009. Courage beyond measure, honor beyond regulation, from the men she saved. Team Echo, October 15, 2009. Below that, a list of names, 13 names, every man who had been on that mountain, every man who should have died but did not, because a 19-year-old girl climbed a cliff and made shots that should have been impossible. "This isn't official," Riley whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "The Navy Cross is the second highest military decoration. You can't just make one. You can't just engrave it and give it to someone." "We know," Marcus said. "We also know that the official record will never show what really happened up there. It'll show that you were separated with an honorable discharge for insubordination. It'll show that you violated orders. It'll show that you were a problem, a statistic, a cautionary tale about what happens when discipline breaks down. But we were there," Dalton continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We saw what you did. We know what it cut, and we wanted you to have something that reflects the truth. Not the official truth, not the convenient truth, but the truth that matters. The truth that you saved 13 lives at the cost of your career. The truth that you did the impossible because the possible was not good enough. The truth that you are a warrior in the truest sense of that word." Where do I wear it? Riley asked, trying to joke, trying not to cry, trying to maintain some kind of composure even though composition was becoming impossible. You don't wear it, Dalton said gently. This is not for dress blues or ceremonies or official functions. This is between us. You keep it somewhere private, somewhere safe. And when the weight gets too heavy, when you start to wonder if you made the right choices, when the voices that tell you that you failed get too loud, you take it out and you look at it and you remember that 13 men who were there, who were in the kill box, who were facing death. They say you did the right thing. And their opinion matters more than any official record. Riley held the medal in her palm. It was heavier than it should have been. Not the physical weight, maybe 2 ounces of bronze and ribbon, but the other weight, the weight of recognition, of being seen, of having people who understood that the right thing and the legal thing were sometimes at war with each other, and choosing between them was how you discovered who you really were. What do I do now? Riley asked, the question that had been circling in her head for 3 weeks, the question that had no good answer. I'm not a Marine anymore. I'm not a sniper. I don't have a job. I don't have a career. I don't have a purpose. What am I supposed to do? You're 22 years old, Dalton said. You have 50, 60, maybe 70 years ahead of you. That's a lot of time to figure out what comes next. But what if I don't? What if I can't figure it out? What if all I know how to do is shoot, and all I am is a Marine, and without that, I'm nothing? You're not nothing, Marcus said firmly. You're Riley Cross, daughter of Daniel Cross, who saved 13 men in Mogadishu and then came home and fought the demons for 20 years before they finally won. Sister of Ethan Cross, who died doing his job in a country that didn't want him there, but needed him anyway. Granddaughter of Thomas Cross, who stormed a beach in the Pacific and earned a medal he kept in a shoebox because looking at it hurt too much. You're the 4th generation of a family that stands when others run, that fights when others quit, that survives when survival should be impossible. Dalton added, the uniform doesn't make the warrior. The warrior makes the uniform. And you're a warrior whether the Marine Corps acknowledges it or not, whether you ever put on a uniform again or not, whether you ever fire another shot or not, because being a warrior is not about the weapon you carry. It's about the choices you make when the choices are impossible and making them cost you everything. An old man approached him from the pathway that ran between the sections. He was ancient, maybe 90, his body bent with the weight of years in memory and the particular burden that came from outliving your friends. He wore a World War II veteran's cap, the kind sold at VFW halls and veteran reunions, with patches and pins that told a story to anyone who knew how to read them. 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, the patch that meant he had been in North Africa or Sicily or Normandy or all 3, that he had been young once in a different war, a different century, a different world. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walker, each step a negotiation with gravity and arthritis and bones that had been young 80 years ago and had not been young since. He stopped a few feet from the group and looked at Ethan's headstone with eyes that had seen too much and remembered too well. Your brother? The old man asked, his voice rough with age but still carrying the particular timbre of authority, of someone who had commanded men in combat and still carried that command voice, even though the men he commanded were dust and the battles he fought were history. Yes, sir, Riley said automatically, the Marine training taking over, the habit of respect for elders and veterans and anyone who had earned the right to be called sir. The old man nodded slowly. I lost my brother in France. Normandy, June 6, 1944. He was 20 years old. First wave at Omaha Beach. Never made it off the sand. I watched him die from the landing craft. Watched him take a machine gun, burst to the chest and go down and the tide come in and cover him before I could reach him. The old man's voice did not waver, did not break. This was a story he had told before, had carried for 80 years, had made peace with, in the way that survivors make peace with guilt and grief, and the impossible mathematics of being the one who lived. I think about him every day. Still, after all these years, I'm 92 years old. I've had a good life. Wife, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, career, house, retirement, all of it. And I still think about Eddie every single day. Wonder what kind of life he would have had if that machine gun had been pointed 6 inches to the left. Wonder what he would have done, who he would have married, what his kids would have been like. I'm sorry, Riley said. not knowing what else to say, knowing that sorry was inadequate, but that inadequate was all language offered when you were standing in a cemetery talking to a man who had watched his brother die 8 decades ago. Don't be. The old man looked at her with eyes that were still sharp despite their age. He did his job. He stood in the gap. That's all any of us can do, stand in the gap until someone else can take over. Your brother stood, that matters. That's all that matters, not whether he lived or died. But that he stood, that when the moment came, he didn't run. He did what needed doing. The old man shifted his weight on the walker. You look like you're carrying something heavy. Not the kind of weight you can see. The other kind. The kind that presses down on your shoulders and makes it hard to stand up straight. I know that weight. I've been carrying it since 1944. Riley felt her throat tighten. How do you carry it? She asked. How do you live with it? The old man smiled, a sad expression that suggested he had asked himself that question 10,000 times and had never found a satisfying answer. You don't live with it? You just live. You get up every morning even when getting up seems impossible. You do the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and somewhere along the way the weight becomes part of you. Not lighter, not easier, but familiar. You learn to walk with it, to stand with it, to be yourself plus the weight. And eventually you forget what it felt like to be light. He looked back at the headstone. Your brother is at rest. You're not. So you carry the weight for both of you. That's the deal. That's what survivors do. We carry. And when we can't carry anymore, we find someone younger and stronger, and we pass it to them, and we rest. But until then, we carry, because that's what warriors do. And make no mistake, young lady, you're a warrior. I can see it in your eyes, the same look my brother had, the same look I saw in the mirror after Normandy. The look that says you've stood in the gap and you know what it costs, and you'd do it again if you had to. The old man turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Don't let them make you ashamed of doing the right thing. Don't let the bureaucrats and the paper pushers and the people who never stood in the gap tell you that you failed. You didn't fail. You succeeded in the only way that matters. You brought people home. Remember that. Hold on to that. When the voices in your head get too loud, remember that you brought people home. He shuffled away, the walker scraping against the pathway, each step of victory over entropy and time. The group watched him go in silence. Riley looked back at the headstone, at the Mogadishu cartridge sitting on top, catching the morning sun. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the unofficial Navy cross. She placed it next to the cartridge. 2 pieces of metal that meant nothing to the official record and everything to the people who knew what they represented. I kept my promise, Ethan, Riley whispered to the stone. You told me to come home. I came home. Not the way I wanted, not the way I planned, but I came home, and I'm still standing, and I'm going to keep standing. For you, for Dad, for grandfather, for all the crossmen who stood and fell. I'm going to keep standing. She reached out and touched the marble, feeling the coolness of the stone, the permanence of it. Ethan had been 22 when he died. Riley was 22 now, the same age, the same moment in life where everything should have been possible and nothing seemed certain. But Ethan's possibilities had ended in a dusty road outside Sangin when his foot came down on a pressure plate and the world turned white and loud and final. Riley's possibilities were still ahead of her, unknown, uncertain, terrifying, but possible. She stood up. The men of SEAL Team Echo stood with her. Together, they walked out of Arlington National Cemetery, past row after row of white stones, past the graves of warriors who had stood in their time, who had paid their prices, who had done what needed doing even when doing it cost them everything. Past the graves of men from Valley Forge and Gettysburg and Belleau Wood and Iwo Jima and Khe Sanh and Fallujah. Past the unnamed and the forgotten and the ones whose sacrifices had been filed away in archives that no one read anymore. But they were not forgotten. Not really. Because every white stone was a memory, every name was a story, every life was a gap that had been filled. A moment when someone stood when standing was hard, when running would have been easier, when quitting would have been understandable. Riley did not know what came next. She did not know where she would go, or what she would do, or how she would carry the weight of being right and being punished for it, of saving lives and losing her career, of doing the impossible and being told it was not good enough. But she knew this. She was Riley Cross. She was her father's daughter. She was her brother's sister. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. She was the girl who climbed the cliff and made the impossible shot and refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. She was the woman who stood in the gap when the gap needed filling. She was a warrior, not because of the uniform, not because of the rank, not because of the official recognition, but because when the moment came, when the choice was presented, when survival and annihilation hung in the balance, she had made the hard choice, the right choice, the only choice that mattered. And that finally was enough. The war was over. The reckoning was done. The legacy was secure. She was going home. And this time she was going home whole. Not undamaged, not unchanged, not the same girl who had left West Virginia 3 years ago, with dreams of glory and honor, and proving something to people who were already dead. But whole in a different way. Whole in the way that broken things become when they are repaired with care and time, and the understanding that the cracks are part of the story, that the scars are proof of survival, that being broken and healing are not opposites, but partners in the long journey of becoming who you are meant to be. She walked toward the parking lot with the team around her, the morning sun warm on her face, the weight of the unofficial Navy Cross in her pocket, the memory of the Mogadishu cartridge on her brother's grave, the knowledge that somewhere in West Virginia her mother was waiting, that somewhere in the future there were choices to be made and lives to be lived and gaps to be filled. The mountains were behind her. The war was over. The reckoning was done. But the standing would never stop, because that was what Cross women did. They stood, they fought, they refused to break. And when breaking was inevitable, they put themselves back together and stood again. Riley Cross was going home, finally, truly, completely going home. And she was ready.